I call to order the September 27th, 2021 City Council / successor agency to the Redevelop Agency / Housing Authority regular meeting. Would you all please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance
to the flag
to the
of the
flag
United States of America
and to the
republic
for which it stands,
and
one nation,
indivisible,
liberty and justice for all.
Item 3 is changes to the order of the agenda. Are there any changes?
No changes this evening, Madam Mayor.
Okay, then moving on. Item 4, report from closed session.
Madam Mayor, there's no report from the closed session tonight.
Okay, moving on again. Item 5 is council communications and announcements. City communications and announcements are brief items from members of the City Council regulating upcoming events in the community and correspondence that they have received. They are informational. Finally, informational in nature, and no action will be taken on these items at this meeting. Okay. Are there any hands?
So Mayor Fisher, I'm seeing Vice Mayor McDowell has her hand up.
Okay. Sarah McDowell.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I am just so thrilled to have you here tonight, and you're just doing a great job. I wanted to let you know that right off the bat. What I wanted to tell you, Madam Mayor, and my colleagues is that, as some of you may know, I I sit on the board of the Housing Endowment and Regional Trust, and Ron knows that group very well. And I just wanted to share something that we worked on last week, where we approved assistance to a mid-pen housing project in San Mateo. And it's a 225 unit, 100% affordable rental housing project. It's a great project that will house individuals with developmental disabilities, formerly homeless households, and public employees. And I just wanted to point out this really exciting project given our upcoming discussion this evening on housing. And I wanted to note that the total development cost per unit for this project is about $750,000, including parking. Excluding the parking, the cost per unit is $665,000. So the total development cost for this building of this project, this 225 units, is $169 million. And I thought that was a really important data point to share with my colleagues and the public tonight as we embark on a housing discussion. Thank you. That's all I have tonight, Madam Mayor.
Okay. Thank you for that. Are there any more? Okay, I don't see any more hands, so moving on. Next on the agenda is public comment. Persons wishing to address the City Council on matters not on the posted agenda may do so. Each speaker is limited to 2 minutes. If the item you are speaking on is not listed on the agenda, please be advised that the City Council may briefly respond to statements made or questions posted as allowed under the Brown Act. The City Council's general policy is to refer items to staff for attention or have a matter placed on a future City Council agenda for a more comparative action or report, and formal public discussion and input at that time. Crystal, is there anyone wishing to speak?
Yes, Madam Mayor, we do have 2 hands up. First one is Heather. You should be able to unmute.
Hi, is there any video associated with this?
I'm sorry, what was that?
When we do the Zoom, is there any video associated with this?
No.
Okay, I had come prepared with video prompts. So, okay, my name's Heather, and I work for a property owner that's adjacent to your 817 Walnut property. And the reason why I wanted to speak this evening is I know that you have a housing development discussion later on, but I don't know if the city or the Planning Commission is aware that there have been changes to the plans for the building that were brought to our attention by the contractor last week. If you walk past the building on Olive Street between Laurel and Walnut, you will see raw concrete mason unit block. And on the plans that were approved by the city and plans by the Planning Commission, the materials on the side of the building were supposed to be brick facade or stucco on the second and sort of higher elevations. And our concern is that apparently, according to the contractor, the raw concrete without any finish on it is going to be the final material. And my understanding is that based on the code compliance certificates and things that were approved previously for public comment, we looked meticulously at how the impact to the neighbors, to the people around the surrounding area, and the fact that the contractor or the city, whomever it might have been, the fact that the raw concrete is going to be allowed as the final material, we have concerns about. So we know that you folks want to have the marquee, affordable housing, but we don't think that changing the materials and the final product after public comment and after approval by both the city and the Planning Commission should be acceptable. And if you walk past, it looks as though it's literally is a material that has not been finished. So we hope that you folks follow through to make sure that the contractor puts on the facade that was approved.
Thank you. Mayor Fisher, if I may, might I ask staff to follow up with Heather? And Heather, if you could send the city clerk your email address and or contact information, that would be helpful. I see, Jeff, you're bringing on your video.
Yep, just to say thank you very much for that, and we will be happy to do that and look into the issue.
Thank you.
Is there anyone other person wishing to speak?
Yes, looks like Sonia Elks has her hand up. Sonia, if you can go ahead and unmute.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, for taking my comment in City Council. I just wanted to express that I have some concern about something Public Works is planning for, I think 4 or 5 more, or moving toward putting in more concrete bulb outs along Melody this time. And I have concerns that we are going to be making it difficult for bikes to move through this area. With the rise in popularity of e-bikes, and scooters, Melody is not a challenge for these micromobility devices to get through. If we want to encourage micromobility, we need to make sure that they can get through our streets and not put bulb outs that are not passable for bicyclists and micromobility users. So I just wanted to express that my dismay and concern that seems to be happening again. There's many ways to do with paint or with reflective posts to make it safer for pedestrians to cross. And I can send information and pictures by email, but I wanted to express that I have serious concerns about this happening on Melody.
Thank you, Sonia. And here again, Mayor Fisher, if I may, Jeff, could I ask that staff please follow up with Sonia on this item?
We can reach out, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
There are no further hands, Madam Mayor.
Okay. Moving on. Item 7 is the consent calendar. Are there any items council would like to pull? Thanks.
Madam Mayor, I'd like to move to approve the consent calendar.
Second.
Okay. Can I have a motion to approve the consent calendar?
I'll move to approve the consent calendar, Madam Mayor.
And I second it.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Crystal, Madam Mayor Fisher, if we could have perhaps City Clerk call the roll.
Okay. Crystal, can you call the roll?
Okay. Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
Councilmember Dugan?
Yes.
Councilmember Rack?
Yes.
Vice Mayor McDowell?
Yes.
And Mayor Parma Lohan?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mayor Ellie Fisher, for joining us today. You did an outstanding job, and look forward to working with you in the future. It looks like we have a couple people that want to make comment. We have Councilmember Rack and then possibly City Manager Maltby.
Yes, Madam Mayor Parma Lohan, thank you. I just want to thank Mayor Fisher for her excellent work in managing the beginning of the meeting. I thought she did a fantastic job and really appreciate the way she handled that. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
And Madam Fisher, on behalf of the city staff, we'd just like to thank you for your participation and your leadership tonight in helping us with our city council meeting. You did an excellent job.
No problem. Thanks for joining.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Have a good
Hi,
night.
Ellie. Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too.
All right. So now we'll move on to study session item 8A. Receiving a presentation on the housing element update. And this presentation will be given to us by Lisa Porras, Advanced Planning Manager. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and good evening, council members. This item is a presentation on the housing element update project as requested by the City Council during its September 8th study session on the East Side Innovation District Vision Plan. And I think, oops, did I do that? Let me go back. What did I do? I'm sorry. Let's see. I know I have control of these, but it doesn't appear so.
Crystal,
I'm not
Lisa,
sure what I did.
Lisa, I'll grab. Okay, if you can, don't move your mouse anymore because I can't grab it when you do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Crystal, and let me try that again. Let's see. Crystal, maybe I should have you do it. I don't know if it's an issue with the mouse. I apologize for that.
No worries.
Okay, great. Thank you for getting me back on track. Okay, so continuing on with that, the Housing Element Update Project. The council requested this study session during its last meeting, its last study session, I will say, but on a different project, the East Side Innovation District Vision Plan. So here we are this evening, and one of the things I wanted to start out right away is that the Housing Element Update, the one that we're currently working on, will cover the period between 2023 and 2031. And the purpose of the Housing Element Update, as required by state law, is to ensure that the city has development regulations and policies in place to ensure that its fair share of the Bay Area regional housing need can be met. In our case, that housing need is at least 2,735 new housing units across different affordability levels. Next slide. So this project is essentially a 2-year project, and we're halfway through. We signed a contract with MIG consulting firm the year 2020, and then we had our first community workshop in November that same year. And since that time, we've continued to have a dialogue with the community, which I will go into a little bit of detail in just a moment. But really the main bulk of the work is working with the community to have a conversation and get their feedback and ideas and potential solutions for how we can meet our housing needs, and moving forward with identifying, existing conditions, potential constraints. And we're now in the process of really kind of honing in on potential sites and solutions to meet the RHNA. So that's where we are right now in spring of summer 2021. Where we're headed at next is to, following some study sessions with the Planning Commission and City Council, is to start writing the draft elements and zoning amendments to this project. And we anticipate we will have documents released in the first quarter of next year, most likely in March 2022. And then we'll start the process with working with the state California Department of Housing and Community Development. Our environmental analysis will be going on at that same time. And then looking at heading into hearings with the Planning Commission first, and then ultimately City Council following that about a year from now. And along the way, there's still opportunities for the public to be engaged, including during public comment at tonight's meeting, when the draft elements come out through the CEQA process, and then future upcoming formal hearings with the Planning Commission and City Council. Next slide. So as I mentioned, this housing element is part of a larger project. And the larger project, we were referring to that as the focus.
City Clerk, okay. Your audio cut out for just a few minutes, Lisa.
Oh, sure. So let me just start again real quick. Can you still hear me?
I can now, yes.
Okay. The project is a focused general plan update. And the reason why it's focused is that we're only looking at 2 elements right now of the entire general plan. The general plan consists of 7 state mandated elements or topics or chapters that we need to address. And we're looking at housing specifically because it's required to be updated every 8 years. So we're in the process of updating it from its 2015 to 2023 cycle to 2023, 2031. In addition to that, several new laws have been passed to address the safety element. And then the third item that we're likely going to need to update and modify is the land use section. Because of housing element changes, we anticipate there's a high probability that we're going to need to address our land use, general plan land use designations, and perhaps some policy language and text descriptions to go along with that. The project also includes a zoning ordinance amendment because as we plan for housing, we don't want to just set policies in place, but we want our zoning ordinance to work for us in a way that's going to allow that housing to occur. So part of this overall project, this 2-year project, does include amendments to the zoning ordinance. And that's what we're also going to be diving into a little bit later during the presentation, talking about that and continuing on with the work that we're currently involved in. And then finally, as with a project of this scope and scale, we are going to be doing an environmental impact report, or EIR, pursuant to the California Environmental Quality Act. So next slide. So the purpose of this project, as I mentioned before, is to comply with state law, but it's also one of the City Council's 7 strategic objectives, which is that the City of San Carlos will actively encourage and support the creation of housing to provide a safe, inclusive, diverse, and affordable supply by facilitating development of housing for all income levels. And this is actually perfectly written, and it really mimics what the state's objective is for housing as well, that we are required to provide our fair share of housing for the region's need and at different affordability levels. Now, this is to comply with state housing element law. And our housing element that we're currently in right now, which I mentioned before, 2015 to 2023, required that we plan for 596 units. And we were able to do that without changing any zoning. Our zoning was set in place that anticipated this level of growth. So we were able to do that without modifying zoning during when the last housing element was adopted in 2015. For this housing element cycle, requires that we plan for at least 2,735 new housing units. And then future cycles coming up would be for the period of 2031 to 2039, and then from 2039 to 2047. And as I mentioned before, housing elements are required to be updated every 8 years. And so I wanted to point that out because other long-term long-range planning documents. For example, one is the Climate Mitigation and Adaptation Plan that the council will be looking at later this evening, has a longer-term horizon to the year 2025, whereas this housing element cycle is just for 8 years, but that's by design, by state law. And then the safety element is also required to be updated to address new aspects relating to climate change, resiliency and adaptation, as well as wildfire. The safety element also covers other hazards such as geologic hazards and flooding, some of which won't need to be updated. And we probably will be looking at flooding for the safety element as well as it relates to climate change. So that's just an overall project purpose that I wanted to share with the council as we move forward. Next slide. So where are we now and what have we accomplished since this project started? Well, the very big thing that we began to do as we started working with MIG is not only transfer a lot of data to them and start talking about our existing conditions, but we wanted to start kicking off a process where we notified the community. And we issued a spotlight newsletter as well as a project website in November of 2020, just before our first community workshop. We completed an existing conditions report as well as a housing needs assessment. And these are two critical parts of the overall housing element update report that will eventually be, or element itself, I should say, that eventually will be assembled together with policies and strategies for accommodating the housing. So those two parts have been completed and may undergo some refinement as we get new information. If we can update them, we certainly will. And then with respect to community outreach and civic engagement, so far we've had 4 community workshops. The first one in November, we wanted to share with the community what the key issues were, like what is the purpose of this project and what is the overall intent, what are we trying to accomplish, and really shared with them information about some of the state's requirements. And we began to hear their concerns as well as some ideas. And it was very interesting and encouraging that right off the bat, the attendees really started sharing with staff and our consultant team some ideas for how housing might be addressed. And then in January, we started looking at housing type, different housing typologies, ranging from single family duplex, fourplexes, all the way to multifamily and mixed use developments, and started having a conversation about site criteria and ideas for where's the best places to locate the new housing. And then in May, August, we really focused on case studies, which I am going to share with the council a little later in the presentation. But we wanted to get the community's sentiment for how they feel about increasing height and density in certain areas of the city as a means to achieve the overall regional housing use allocation. We combined these workshops with community surveys, and we had a good amount of people participating in those surveys that were held late last year and then earlier this year. And where we're at now is we are working actively with all of the input that we received from the community, especially the case studies we received, and looking at how we might solve the RHNA. and meet our housing needs. And like I mentioned before, we want to have study sessions with the Planning Commission and City Council by the end of this year, where we can talk a little bit more in depth in exactly how we propose to solve the solutions, so that we can get the Planning Commission's feedback to share with the council, and ultimately the council direction on how we should go and write the plan. We don't want to write the plan and then bring it to council. We really want to get, because RHNA is a key part of the housing element, we feel it's really important to kind of get buy-in on the proposed solution before we start writing policies and looking at zoning amendments beforehand. We are going to be having an EIR scoping meeting maybe by the end of this year or beginning early next year. And again, the scoping meeting is an opportunity for the public to come and tell us what they want to make sure gets addressed in the environmental impact report. So this is another public input opportunity for the community to get involved in. And then once we have the draft land use, housing, and safety elements drafted and ready to share, we will have another community workshop with the community to show the community how those elements have taken shape, and including the policies and strategies that we will use not only just zoning, but how we might, approach encouraging and incentivizing housing to get built in our community. The next slide. So this next portion of the presentation will cover the regional housing needs determination and the regional housing needs allocation. Before I begin, I do want to share that overall process to determine a regional housing needs determination and the RHNA is really quite complex and comprehensive. In fact, there is a state housing element law that requires councils of government, and in our case, ABAG, or the Association of Bay Area Governments, to develop a methodology and to distribute housing units to its cities and counties. And that methodology itself needs to be approved by the state and then adopted by the Council of Governments, or the ABAG Executive Board. So how this process began is that the state used the State Department of Finance population projections to develop an overall regional housing needs determination for the 9-county ABAG region. That regional housing needs determination was 441,176 units. From that, and working through the adopted and state-approved methodology, 2,735 housing units were allocated to the city of San Carlos. So the RHNA methodology is adopted and finalized. The number that you see before you on the screen, the 2,735 number, is a draft number. However, based upon the process that it's been through so far, we don't expect any changes to that number once the official number becomes adopted by the end of this year. Next slide. So just a little bit about the regional housing needs allocation methodology. And I want to point out one correction. And the government code section that's listed in the staff report, as well as on the screen here, is in fact 65584D. So again, 65584D. And I apologize for that typo. But in case anyone was really wanting to follow that and see the language as it's written in state law, you'll want to go to 65584D. So sorry about that, but thank you for allowing me to correct that. So the methodology to allocate this regional housing needs determination, those 441,000 units across Bay Area jurisdictions, needed to meet 5 objectives that are required by state law. One is to increase housing supply and the mix of housing types, tenure, and affordability in cities and counties in an equitable manner, to promote infill development and socioeconomic equity, protect environmental and agricultural resources, encourage efficient development patterns, and achieve greenhouse gas emission targets. The third objective is to promote an improved intra-regional jobs housing relationship, including a balance between low-wage jobs and affordable housing. The fourth is to balance disproportionate household income distributions. For example, this would mean more high-income allocation to a lower income area and perhaps more low income area to areas that are generally higher income. And then the last is to affirmatively further fair housing. And basically that means that they want cities and counties to take meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination, to overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities. So that's a little bit about affirmatively further fair housing. So this whole methodology needed to be developed with these objectives in mind. So which in turn creates, next slide, please, a regional housing needs allocation that has been given to not just our cities, but all cities in San Mateo County that take all of these into account. So here's a breakdown of our regional housing needs allocation by affordability levels. And you can see that the majority of the numbers, once you start looking at this, are actually in our affordable levels. So very low, low, and moderate all add up to 1,602 units. So as compared to above moderate, which is market rate, we can see that we have a higher amount of our RHNA in the affordability levels. And again, just a reminder that it's not the city's job to build the units, although I know in the past we have worked with affordable housing providers and we can do that on certain pieces of properties. But for the most part, we're really looking at establishing policies and putting the right zoning in place so that the market can deliver these units as they're needed in our community. So overall, for San Mateo County, the total regional housing needs allocation was just over 47,000. So of that amount, 2,700 was assigned to the city of San Carlos. And again, this is for the 8-year period. And I will say that one of the things that we decided to do, and I'll explain in the next slide, is to take 30% of the affordable housing portion of the RHNA and add that to the overall number of 2,735, which means that we would want to plan for 3,216 new units. Next slide. Next slide, please. And the reason why we are planning for an additional 481 units, there's essentially 3 reasons. The first reason is that it's good to have a buffer because not every site selected by a city or county will be proposed for affordable housing. And best practices are showing that cities and counties are adding a percentage to their affordable housing portion of the RHNA. And just as an example, they are larger cities, but the cities of San Mateo and Redwood City, our understanding is they're looking at 50% rather than 30% to their affordable housing portion of their RHNA. And it's really best practices. We could go down to 20%, but that would be at most a minimum. And what we're finding in consultation with our colleagues at 21 Elements, working with Baird and Driscoll, is that they're recommending at least 30% of the affordable housing portion. So cities right now are starting to look at this and add this to the RHNA for these very reasons. The second reason is that it's because of a new no net loss provision in state housing law. And essentially what this means is that if a site is identified for affordable housing, but somehow instead is developed for market rate, and that happens sometimes. We have sites and we say, here's a good amount of density, here's our below market rate inclusionary housing ordinance, or we think this site is a great site for affordable housing, but something happens in the marketplace where that particular site isn't developed for affordable housing and goes to market rate, then we need to find another site to make up for that affordable housing site that we just selected. So that's the no net loss provision. And then the third reason is that the state, not only are they required to certify our housing element, but they're also very much involved in the sites that we select. When we show them our vacant and underutilized sites map and list parcel by parcel all the attributes of each parcel and try and make the case that these are the parcels that we think are likely to be developed and why, the state has the authority to approve them. And they basically decide whether they meet the state's criteria for site suitability and feasibility or not. So it's always good to kind of go in and plan for a buffer, because we know that not every parcel that we select, is going to be approved by the state. Next slide. So as we began thinking about solutions for meeting this 2,735 unit or 3,216 unit plan for, some of the things that we look at include approved housing projects. Right now, we do have projects that are under construction, and if they receive their certificate of occupancy or final inspection after June 30th next year, they can count towards that 2,700 number. So a lot of things are in play here. It just means that as we really look to figure out how many parcels we have, what can we count that's in the pipeline today? And the way state housing element law works is that we do get to count projects that are currently under construction, but only if they get their finals after June 30th next year. We're also looking at projects in the pipeline. And then the third thing that we look at are potential sites. As I've been mentioning before, we look at our vacant sites. There's not very many, but we do have some. The majority of what we do have are underutilized sites that could redevelop. We also could look at the amount of accessory dwelling units that we could expect to be built over the horizon of this 8-year plan. Then the other thing we can look at is what can we do to our existing zoning land use regulations to help bolster and strengthen standards that we already have in place that do allow duplexes, bungalow court type developments, townhomes, and small lot single unit development. And I listed these specifically because I want to share with the council that San Carlos does allow duplexes, townhomes, and small lot single unit developments and bungalow courts only by way of a conditional use permit. So that could be considered a constraint or an impediment. So that could be something that we remove during this housing element cycle and instead make it by right instead of a conditional use permit. So that's an example of the other thing that we can do. And then finally, the last thing that we can look at is, well, what could we do to increase density and building height on sites throughout the city? And if we did so, how much more housing might that yield towards meeting our arena? Next slide. So our approach for this and where we began is we started to look at, well, where does it make sense to start with? If we look at the overall city land use map, the zone map, where in the city should these housing units be placed? And what we started with was looking at our areas in the city that already allowed residential land uses, and the zoning already supported these type of residential uses. And the reason for this is best practice to think of this as that these areas are best positioned for redevelopment. Why? Because these areas are walkable, they're close to schools and shops and areas, parks where people spend their leisure time, and require minimal driving. The second reason is that these areas had existing facilities and resources that are already in really good proximity to everyday needs, such as, getting access, having access to police and fire services, to the library, our youth center, parks and schools, as well as shops and restaurants and personal services. And the last two things, and I think are really important to point out, is that the majority of the city's overall land area, just all of the land area, the majority of it is mostly devoted to residential uses. So over 70% of the city's land area is already devoted to residential uses, whereas only 16% is currently devoted to commercial and industrial. So we thought before that we go into looking at our kind of like our very sparse commercial and industrial land use space, what would it mean if we can take a really good look at where residential is already allowed and already close to services and everyday needs like school, and what would it mean if we modified some of the zoning there? The other reason is that the City of San Carlos's general plan, and this is included in the staff report on packet pages 60 and 61, does have general plan goals that support the city's long-term economic and fiscal sustainability. In fact, one of the goals does in fact, read prohibit conversion of property designated for industrial and commercial and on the east side to non-industrial and commercial activities. So we wanted to take a moment and talk about this because I know this came up at the study session on September 8th, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more. The next slide. So as we began to consider, what's really happening with, the marketplace, with our zoning, with our land use policies and zoning development standards now, we looked at, what is currently happening right now with our 2015-2023 housing element. We know that out of our 596 arena allocation for that period, we built 575 new units. So we're doing pretty good in the overall number. But where we're falling short is in the affordability level. We've only built 49 affordable new housing units, and we have 364 more to go. The other thing that we discovered is that the majority of these infill projects that we see, the new projects that we see around town, the majority of them are condominiums, and they're occurring in sizes that are quite large in the mixed use and multifamily zones. We also discovered that most of them are building below maximum allowable densities. I would say more often than not, maybe not most. And for example, since 2015, we had 9 projects that reached the maximum densities, whereas 12 projects did not. So that just adds a little bit of flavor to kind of like what's happening and how are our current regulations being used by the marketplace. We also reached out to developers and had interviews with them and asked them, what are some of the constraints towards getting more units on the property? One of the things that they told us was that height limited them, as well as the density or units per acre development regulation also limited them. And in addition, especially on some of the small sites, it became really challenging to meet our parking requirements. So this is some of the feedback that we were given. And then the last category really involved working with the community to see how they feel about increasing density and height in certain areas of the city. And to have that conversation with the community, we looked at 2 different areas of the city. One was small sites along Laurel Street that are zoned for mixed-use development in the UN zoning district. And then we also looked at sites along El Camino Real, because El Camino Real is a very significant in terms of its placement, location to bus lines, and different regional opportunities. And it does house one of our highest densities, 50 units to the acre. So we wanted to look at some case studies there as well. Next slide. So what I want to share with the council, because I think this will speak largely to where staff is possibly headed, and we're still looking at this, but where we're possibly headed is increasing densities and allowing taller buildings in key areas of the city. And so we want to share with you some of the case studies that we looked at with the community and kind of unpack that with you as well, and then kind of land on what densities we're currently looking at. So we'll go ahead and get started. So I want to start with the MUN zoning district, and the star on the map here shows the site that we actually looked at. It was kind of in the proximity of Arroyo and Laurel Street. Next slide. So where we started was with our existing development standards. So this particular site, which is identified here as scenario A, which is just looking at what our existing standards allow to be built. And the actual address here is 910 Laurel Street. So when we worked with consultants, and I will say for the record that the work that we're seeing here on the screen is a result of work we did with Opticos. And some of the council members may remember Opticos, who was the consulting firm that helped us with the single family house size issue. So some of the work that we started to get into, but we paused because we knew the housing element was coming up, was looking at some of our mixed use zoning districts. We knew right away that our 20 units to the acre was actually prohibiting the amount of units that could be built. So on a site, it's just over 5,000 square feet. What could, excuse me, it's not over, that's the commercial portion, but it's a 50-foot wide lot. I think it's maybe a 5,000 square foot lot, most probably. But based on the zoning, the maximum density of 20 units to the acre, it basically said that the maximum units that you can build on a project, on a new project at this site, would be just 2 units. But the allowable number of stories could be 4 and 50 foot in height, although there are transitional standards that require that the building steps down relative to its rear setback or rear property line, because single family is of course adjacent right behind this. So what we're seeing is that the zoning was really, the maximum units to the acre was really limiting the amount of units that could be built. Next slide, please. So what we did was run through a number of scenarios, and I'm skipping ahead to scenario D, which is the highest units to the acre scenario that we looked at for this site. But this is really just to show that if we increase the density to 50 units to the acre, this would actually yield 5 units. So we more than double the amount of units that could be built. Again, this is a modest site, but every unit counts when we're trying to reach the RHNA number. And we also found that we could do this in a 3-story context, right? So we didn't need to go up to 4 stories to get to the 5 units. Next slide. And so when we summarized all of these scenarios with the community, looking at, scenario A in the second column, what could be built, and we really kind of dove into the weeds on this, and we looked at the amount of open space that was required, probability for how much of it would be commercial ground floor, applied the parking standards, this is what we got, 2 units in scenario A with our existing. If we increase the units to the acre to 30 in scenario B, it yielded 1 more unit. If we doubled it to 40 units to the acre, as shown in scenario C, then we could double the units. And then lastly, in the fourth example, scenario D, if we increase that to 50 units to the acre, we could get 5. But the caveat with 5 units, being the 5 units or accomplishing 50 units to the acre, we did find this is where we'd have to reduce the parking standards. So highlighted in gold here, you'll see that, in order to do that, the caveat would be that we would need to reduce the parking. Whereas in all of the other scenarios, we can keep the parking, constant and consistent with what we currently have in place. If you can hit the button, Crystal, I think, there we go. So what we ultimately heard from the community is that they would be favorable of a density increase to 40 units to the acre. And this would allow us to keep our parking in place. Next slide. So moving on to El Camino Real, we did 2 case studies here. One was within the 1100 block of El Camino Real, where we did look at some lot consolidation, combining a couple of lots together to see what kind of density might be yielded in that particular context. And then the second site that we looked at was in the northern part of El Camino Real on a site that was much larger. In fact, it was just 2 sites. So we wanted to see, well, what can we do with this kind of smaller lot sizes, but then some of them consolidated versus a much larger site at 11 El Camino Real. So let's go into this. Next slide, please. So here we're showing a segment of El Camino Real. And what I wanted to show right at the get-go was what does this look like overall? What did we share with the community? And what would it mean if we increased our existing standards from 4 stories to 6 stories or to 8 stories and at different heights, going higher from what we allow in our existing code now at 50 feet, going up to 75 and 90 feet. And these are massing studies, and we really took the time to explain to the communities, to the participants at the workshop, trying not to react so much to the appearance of these, We know in San Carlos that we have a very high standard, but for the purposes of the case studies, we were really trying to convey, the overall massing and height to the community so they can get a feel for what that might look like along El Camino Real and at 3 different scales. So next slide, please. So jumping into the first scenario, so this is the 1100 block of El Camino Real. And what we did here is we said, okay, let's take a look at our existing standards, but because we hear often that parking is often a constraint, let's look at 2 scenarios with our existing standards, but one of the scenarios looking at what would it mean if we reduced our parking. So the column to the left, or the first column, in this scenario, we were able to yield a total of 34 units under our existing code and park it with a total of 52 parking spaces per our current parking requirements. But what happened if we reduced our parking standards? So and I can't remember what they are, so if you do have questions on those, I'm going to give Lisa Brownfield, who's our consultant, the heads up. Hopefully she can start looking into that in case you have any questions. But we did reduce our parking standards, and then we said, okay, what happens if we reduce them? Does this yield more units? And we learned that it didn't. So what that told us right away is that even if we reduce our parking standards, our maximum units to the acre being at 50 and our maximum height being at 50 feet were actually the limiting factors for getting more units. So we started to see that right away just by looking at our existing standards. Next slide, please. Then we moved into a scenario, what we're referring to as scenario A. And what would it mean if we allowed 6 stories and increased the height from 50 to 75? And what would that look like if we kept our parking regulations consistent with what they are today? Well, we found just by doing that, we can increase the units to 84. But if we reduce the parking, what that started to show us was that now we can get more units if we reduce our parking standard. So in these 2 particular contexts, the one to the left where we keep our parking consistent with what we have today, the resulting density out of that massing would be about 122 units to the acre. But if we reduced our parking, the resulting density would be 141 units to the acre. So next we looked at, well, what does this look like if we were to go even higher? So next slide, please. So in this next slide, scenario B, we looked at an 8-story context and a 90-foot height limitation. And keeping our parking consistent, that increased it to 112 units and resulting in about 163 units to the acre. As applying reduced parking standards, it would further increase it to its highest unit count at 130, which would equate to a resulting density of 189 units to the acre. When we had this conversation and shared these figures with the community, they preferred scenario A. So we can go to the next slide. And this just sort of summarizes, what each scenario was yielding. And you'll remember in that first example, which is the yellow shaded area on the table, the 4-unit context, we got 34 units and 52 spaces. The units didn't change when we reduced parking. However, in scenario A and B, we did started to see more units could be built once we started reducing the parking. But ultimately, if you can just click on the mouse crystal, what the community preferred was scenario A in this particular context. And there are several assumptions. So there's a lot going here on the slide, but I'll just focus on the bottom. Several assumptions that we used in calculating how many units we could get in this particular massing context. It was a mix between studio, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and 3 bedrooms. So we wanted to share, what does that look like? So studios at 10%, 1 bedrooms at 55, 2 bedrooms at 25, and then 3 bedrooms at 10%. And then we also factored in that in some of these multifamily or mixed-use projects, we often see some amenity space also provided as well as open space. So we took 23% out of the massing to accommodate for open space and amenities. So these are all factored in there. So next slide, please. So the next case study is the El Camino Real site. And again, what we found here is that even if we reduced our parking standards, it would still yield 110 units for this particular site on 11 El Camino Real. Next slide, please. And then again, as we started to adjust the parking standards, the unit count rose significantly. But if we kept our parking standards in place, as indicated on the column to the left, we can get 258 units on this site with 323 parking spaces, resulting in a density of about 117 units to the acre versus 133 with the reduced parking standards. Next slide. In the final scenario that we want to share, which is again the 8 stories and 90-foot height maximum, again through applying our parking standards, in this particular scenario, we can reach up to over 300 units with just over 400 parking spaces, resulting in 148 units to the acre, where again, with parking reductions in place, yielding a few more units, a little bit more than just a few more units, that would result in 177 units to the acre. Next slide, please. So once again, when we looked at all of this together, and Crystal, you can hit the mouse, the community preferred scenario A, which was resulting in 117 units to the acre. So looking at both the MUN example, where the community felt comfortable with doubling the density from 20 to 40, plus this the El Camino Real case studies with 117 units to the acre and 122 units to the acre on the lot consolidation site, we rounded that to 120 units to the acre. And again, the unit mix for this 11 El Camino Real site is the same as the others, with the same assumption for open space and amenities. So again, the community generally felt comfortable with scenario A. Next slide, please. During that conversation with the workshop participants, we asked them how they would feel if we extended that to some other mixed use and multifamily areas in San Carlos. And they generally felt okay with it, but I will say that there was a lot of concern about higher density next to single family residential. And on this slide here to the right, the image to the right is the zoning map of the city, and all the areas in light yellow are single family residential. The brown areas are multifamily residential, and the different shades of purple and pink, and dark purple and fuchsia are the mixed use zones. So when we asked them how they would feel about extending that to these areas, they were generally comfortable, but wanted to make sure that we didn't go too far and not consider, the context between multifamily and single family residential. The other thing that we shared with them, was that in this particular context, let's leave the downtown core out, recognizing that, for many years, our downtown core is considered the living room, and let's leave that off the table for now. And finally, I did mention transitional standards, but the community wanted to make sure that our existing transitional standards would remain in place and perhaps even be strengthened to ensure that, there's sensitivity to that existing context. We have been having conversations with the City Council Housing Subcommittee, and during a conversation that we had with the subcommittee, it came up that maybe we shouldn't leave out the downtown core, that maybe there's possibilities to look at the downtown core and not necessarily omit it from the possibilities. So I did want to share that with the larger council as well. Next slide, please. So the work in progress that we have today, and this table is included in your staff report packet, both as a table and as on some kind of sketched out zoning diagrams, zoning map, and sketched onto the zoning map in terms of what we would be looking at. So what we wanted to really be candid with the council with is that we are wanting to look at the input that we received at these workshops by increasing the density to 120 units to the acre in areas all along El Camino Real and in certain areas in proximity to the downtown, and also increase the MUN or the mixed use zoning district along Laurel from 20 to 40 units to the acre. In some of these cases, we are looking at the existing context and geography, whereby not every zoning parcel that is zoned, for example, say RM59, is going to automatically increase to 100 units to the acre. If we just focus at the top two rows of this table here, we do want to be mindful and keep some of the parcels that are RM59 stay at RM59 when, for example, they're adjacent to an RS6 zoning district. But in other areas where they're not, and there's opportunity to increase it, we can look at 100 units to the acre. If you have any questions again on this is in your staff report. I don't think I want to go through every line item here, but I do want to disclose that there would be density increases if in fact this is the solution that we want to go with, and it's something we're currently looking at now with our consulting team. Next slide. So the next steps in meeting the RHNA is to really run the density calculations using geographical information systems analysis, which allow us to look at a parcel by a parcel level on applying these new units to the acre standards. So this is something that we would want to continue to work on and then bring back to the Planning Commission and City Council. Our goal is to do that bring it back to the Planning Commission in October and hopefully City Council in November, where we can really focus on, what are we actually doing to meet the RHNA, and do we have the Planning Commission's input and guidance, and ultimately City Council direction on how to make the RHNA. We also, as I mentioned before, are going to need to show our sites to the State Department of Housing and Community Development. Again, we do have the authority to approve of those sites, and based upon what our neighbors are doing in Southern California, in the SCAG region, or the Southern California Association of Governments, it looks like there's 2 to 3 evaluations by HCD before they will really sign off and approve the sites that have been selected. So we're just, so this is kind of, a much more rigorous housing element 8-year update cycle because of the significantly increased RHNA numbers, because the state is looking more closely at the sites to be selected. So we don't anticipate getting an answer from HCD until next summer, because it could take several rounds of review. But we do want to be in a position where we have the City Council's blessing, if you will, on what we're going forward with and what we're presenting to the state and trying to work through the state to get approval from. And then the next steps, in addition to that, are really defining and refining new development standards, or what are zoning regulations for mixed use and multi-family zones. So this is the conclusion of my presentation. But as the council, I'm sure, is aware, there have been several new housing laws that have just recently passed. So we do need to take these into consideration. So we want to kind of, provide some information about those before we close and open it up to questions. So I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Aronson, Economic Development and Housing Manager. Thank you. Aaron?
Thanks, Lisa. Crystal, if you go ahead, next slide, please. So as you are probably well aware, the governor recently passed a number of bills affecting housing in California. So I'm going to give you a quick update regarding 3 of them here tonight. The first is Senate Bill 8. And so what this bill did is it extended the Housing Crisis Act through 2030. And what the Housing Crisis Act does is it locks in development standards, fees, and zoning at the time a preliminary application is submitted. Then additionally, a jurisdiction has one chance to identify incomplete items in initial application and may not request submission of any new information that was not in the initial list of missing items. It also prohibits jurisdictions from conducting more than 5 hearings if a proposed housing development complies with objective general plan and zoning standards, and it prohibits zoning and development policy changes that would lessen the intensity of housing, so essentially decreasing density. Now, with regards to the implications for San Carlos, these requirements are already something that the city is currently adhering to. So while this Housing Crisis Act had previously been set to expire in 2025, it's now extended to 2030, but otherwise we're still operating under the same norms we have been for the last few years. Next slide, please. Senate Bill 9 is probably the most impactful for San Carlos that the governor signed. And this is the one that allows single family lots to be split into 2 lots and then add duplexes on each of those lots. So you're essentially taking what is currently zoned to allow 1 unit for a single family home can now allow up to 4 housing units. There are some areas that are exempt from this. So for example, historic properties or those with existing affordable housing or those in high risk of flood or fire. Any new lot has to be at least 1,200 square feet. It cannot be used for short-term rentals, and property owners must maintain one of the units as their primary residence for at least 3 years after splitting the property. They also must abide by objective zoning and design review standards, and then parking is not required if the property is within a half mile of a major public transit stop. Up to 1 space per unit can be required if there are no stops nearby. Additionally, the city must allow units built as a result of a lot split to be at least 800 square feet in floor area. Now, with regards to implications for San Carlos, there was a study conducted by the Turner Center at UC Berkeley, and they estimated that an additional 500 housing units could be built in San Carlos. We haven't researched thoroughly into the methodology of that study yet. But essentially what they're saying is it's not that 500 units will be built, but it's what they believe could be built as a result of this change. Next slide, please. The Senate Bill 10 is the other one, and it allows local governments to rezone neighborhoods that are near mass transit to increase density with apartment complexes of up to 10 units per property. Now, this leaves it up to the city. So if the city chose to adopt this ordinance under SB 10, then projects of 10 or fewer units in this area, in these areas, would be able to bypass CEQA. Now, this is entirely up to the council to determine whether or not it wants to introduce an ordinance under SB 10, but there's no requirement to do so. And then that's the last of the bills, but while we're discussing housing, I just wanted to give a quick update regarding our BMR ordinance update that we have been working on at the city. And so one of the primary components of that ordinance is the inclusionary housing portion. And so essentially the city's inclusionary housing ordinance is what requires developments currently of 7 or more units to set aside 15% of their units as below market rate or affordable units. So there are different income levels that qualify as affordable, and we have different requirements for developments depending on whether they are for rent or for sale. On the for sale side, we believe we have found a recommendation that will result in both more affordable units while still making developments feasible. However, we've had trouble on the rental side finding scenarios that produce both more affordable units while still making apartment developments financially feasible. And so we shared this with the housing subcommittee at our last meeting, and they directed us to look into scenarios that would reduce our inclusionary ordinance on the rental side and see whether or not that makes a difference in making apartment projects more feasible. So we completed that work last week, so we should be able to schedule another meeting with the housing subcommittee within the next few weeks to share those results. And then depending on the outcome of that meeting, we should be able to schedule study sessions with the Planning Commission and City Council in potentially November and December, which would then mean that we'd have hearings to potentially adopt the ordinance in early next year. And with that, I believe we're ready to move on to questions on the next slide.
Thank you, Adam. And just to wrap up, thank you, Councilmember, Madam Mayor, and council members. I just wanted to let the council know who's available tonight to answer questions. Both Alex Bay and I are available, as well as Adam Aronson, Lisa Costa-Sanders, and Aaron Atkin, as well as Lisa Brownfield, our consultant from MIG. And just a reminder to the public who may be watching, more information about the Housing Element Update or to sign up and follow along and get emails, you can go to sancarlos2040.org. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Adam. So we'll start with, if we could just do a couple questions each from each council member, so that way everybody gets an opportunity. We'll start with Councilmember Collins and then go to Councilmember Dugan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Lisa and Adam. That was a very thorough, if not lengthy, presentation, but it's all good information, things that we really needed to know. My question is regarding the units along El Camino. A while back, it was pointed out that a lot of those lots, particularly south of San Carlos Avenue going down to Redwood City, are rather shallow lots. And they make it problematical for aggregating properties and potentially developing them. And what I want to know is how can we encourage development, or what are your thoughts about encouraging developments and maybe aggregation of these properties so that we could build some of those projects that you were showing to us?
Lisa, I think I can try that one. Thank you, Councilmember Collins. You know, one of the key things is the density and the height that we looked at. Those are the two key limiting factors in this whole thing. So even on a small site where it was impossible or very challenging to develop, just increasing the density and height on these small units or small properties makes it infinitely more feasible to do. But you're right. Developers, the developers who are going to do 10 or 30 or 100 units, they're going to need more land area to do that. And so that requires assemblage. And there's a number of different tools that cities can use to help that process along. And, we'll be exploring a number of those tools when we come back to the city council later, but things like sliding density scales and things like that are some tools that incentivize developers to get something more, the more land area that they get to develop. And so that's just one example of some of the tools that are available to encourage assemblage. Assemblage isn't easy, but the economics make it more palatable and interesting for the development community. So anything that you can do to remove constraints, it makes them more apt to assemble parcels.
Thank you. Just one more question, and that is, I noticed that there are some scenarios that you pointed out, Lisa, that showed that you don't really, by eliminating parking, you don't increase the units depending on which scenario you look at. What I'm curious about is what goes into those spaces that are created by eliminating the parking spaces. If you still get the same number of units, you've eliminated parking, but what's going there?
Lisa, maybe I'll take a crack at this one too, but it's a cost. So what you're doing is you're making it much more feasible from an economic standpoint to make it pencil, because each one of those parking spaces, for instance, if it's just even a surface parking space on the ground floor, it probably costs nearly $50,000 just for one parking space. If you put it in underground or you have mechanical parking, then the cost of each space goes up from there. So especially on these small lots, what we've heard is that, you know, those costs really do count. So a couple of parking spaces is 100,000 minimum that you put back onto the pro forma for the developer.
Thank you. That makes absolute sense. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
All right, thank you. All right, Councilmember Dugan, a couple of questions, and then Councilmember Rex.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. Quick one. Well, you know, 2,735 units for arena allocation. That's a lot of units. I do recognize that. But I do just point out that, you know, the goal there seems to be, it looked like, to achieve a 1.5 to 1 jobs housing balance ratio. And I just note, you know, the jobs that we see lining up in our town, I've heard everywhere from, you know, 7 to 10,000. Just going with the 8,000, even if, and I do believe all those jobs will likely be developed and hit during this next arena cycle. So if you just take that, you know, 2735 over 8,000, you get 3 to 1. So, you know, we're going to be moving in the wrong direction on housing ratio, even if we meet this entire arena. So I guess my question is, has staff given any consideration that maybe we should set an even higher goal? I mean, I realize the buffer, but even that won't get us there. I mean, should we as a city actually think more about housing than what Rena's telling us, given we have more jobs coming our way than the average city as well?
Lisa, I think I'll start and then I'll have you talk about how jobs housing is looked at from a regional standpoint. But we want to run the numbers on the jobs housing. So, you know, we've been doing lots of back of the napkin calculations. I know a lot of folks I've talked to in the community. We've had numerous discussions about jobs housing, what's appropriate for this city, for other cities in San Mateo County, and also the 9-county Bay Area region. So what we're doing is we're working with an economist to develop some metrics and data that's real accurate, as accurate as we can get in terms of jobs housing balance. What does it really mean to a city, to an area, and what are the implications of it, and what numbers should we be looking at? So I think for staff to kind of get into the details on what's appropriate and what the real numbers are at this time, we'd like to come back to you with some more clear data. And we will do that as we move forward in the process, but we're developing that information right now. And Lisa, maybe you could talk about how the RENA process approached jobs housing.
Sure, Al, and I will do my best. As I mentioned before, it's a really complicated process, but what I can share with the council and what I have learned is that the methodology to allocate the housing units to the different cities and counties took into place what ABAG is calling an intra-regional, I should say, versus city by city job housing balance. And in the analysis that they did when looking at both the West and South Bay subregion. So West would be, you know, where we're located in concert with the South Bay, is that in 2015, they started with a 1.8 jobs housing ratio. And based upon the methodology and the allocations that they distributed it, they would find that by the year 2050, the jobs housing ratio would be 1.5. So overall, they are indicating that the jobs and housing would be more balanced, but on a regional level. So this is information that is outlined in their document called the Final Blueprint, which helped to develop the RENA methodology.
Okay. No, thank you. You know, I do understand it's a regional issue. It just, we got a lot coming our way. My second question is about affordable housing. And I just note over the last cycle, we built 49 affordable over 575 units. That's just 9%. I wonder why that isn't at least our 15% BMR ordinance, but I really want to look forward here and come to understand if our traditional planning development process in San Carlos is yielding 9% on average BMR. I mean, this new RENA allocation, given its affordability requirements, even with that 30% buffer in the denominator, that means half of the units, 50% have to be BMR. And that just tells me we got to start doing something, you know, very different as a city if this is more than just a paper exercise. And I'm just curious, so we're kind of planning where that density can go. But I mean, you know, we've had some discussions as a housing committee on BMR updates, but to go from 9% to 50% tells me we'd have to do something very radical. So am I missing something? Is 50%, like, how do we even make sense of that? I don't think any, you know, I don't think 50% happens in a, you know, normal economic cycle. I mean, unless there's some massive government subsidy coming, I don't know how any development gets achieved on average at 50% affordable. Can someone help me understand that better?
I'll start, and then Adam, feel free to jump in, but you hit something that is an issue in the state of California, and it's a very serious problem. And you know, these are numbers, and what Lisa said earlier in the presentation, the city of San Carlos isn't going to be required to build these units. We just have to plan for them and make sure that there's less constraints for their development and where they can go in our community. But we're not charged with building those units. The city of San Carlos can make it easier for developers to build affordable units. But frankly, what we've seen for many, many years, and the reason that, you know, we have one of the reasons we have a crisis is not just the surplus, the numbers, the demand, but it's the cost of creating an affordable unit. What developer, what market rate developer is, you know, really interested in building those units? It's expensive. The vice mayor mentioned earlier, you know, the astronomical cost of this 100+ unit development project. So it's a matter of economics that hasn't been solved by the marketplace. And I would agree with you, council member, that this will require a group effort, a massive group effort between the public and the private sector to make it work.
I can address the 9% issue there of the discrepancy between 15%. And essentially a large reason for that is our inclusion ordinance has changed since that time. Previously, we legally weren't allowed to require that BMR units be built in apartment buildings, but that changed within the last few years. So now that is not the same. Now we do require that 15%, and that will likely be changing in the future. And moving forward, we should see at least that percentage, if not more.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And thank you. This is a big issue on affordability.
Thank you. Councilmember Rack.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And thanks to Lisa and Adam and Al for all the question answering in their presentations. I have lots of questions, but I'll limit to two in this one. One, I know you did at the sort of the focus groups and the community meetings, you talked about, and you kind of found that sweet spot of, let's say, 75 feet for the height for some of the projects along El Camino that you talked about. But I'm wondering, when you asked the question, did you talk about the potential for the density bonus? Because now you may, in those cases, you may get the density bonus, and now you're going to the 90 feet, which people, as I read from the staff report, weren't so thrilled with. So, I mean, I'm just wondering if that question sort of doesn't accurately portray what could happen. And so are we sort of misleading the public around 75 feet isn't really 75 feet, potentially?
Lisa, you want to try that one?
Yes, and I will ask, maybe Lisa Brownfield can also talk about this as well. But this is actually, this is something that we definitely need to address, because first of all and foremost, we're not trying, to pull a fast one on the community. We really wanted to know where their comfort level was with the overall massing, where they would feel comfortable enough to accept. The other thing is that when applying for the state density bonus, not always might a developer need a concession from height to be another one of the zoning standards. Maybe it's a setback or open space, or it could be some other development standard that could. So basically, the concession comes into play when a developer can't fit the additional housing units within the context of the zoning standards. So that's something that we would want to carefully look at even further, because this is just the very first step of the analysis. There's much more work we would need to do and want to do to ensure that what we've communicated to the public does work, even in conjunction with a state density bonus. Lisa Brownfield, did you want to add anything to that?
Good evening, council members. One of the things that we talked about a little bit, or actually we heard from the community, is they overall they were comfortable with the 75 feet height limit. However, there was also a portion of the community who were okay with taller. And so we as a whole were kind of going a little bit more on the conservative side of that equation. And as Lisa said, not everybody's going to want to come in and want to have additional height beyond that, because you eventually get to different types of construction methods and some other things that are going to come into play. When we talked to the development community, they were very clear that to them, the sweet spot is anywhere from the 65 to 75 to 80 foot range. So we also had this, not only was the community telling us this information, but we also heard from the development community. And when we talked to the development community, we were talking to both for-profit and nonprofit developers. So we were looking at both sides of that. And that's what they were coming back and saying was their kind of sweet spot for looking at what would encourage them to build more housing. In addition to the density increase, would be allowing heights to go that tall. So we kind of took all of that information in together, and then that's why we're coming out with some of the proposal about doing 75 feet.
Okay, that's helpful, Lisa. Both Lisas, thank you in this case. It's helpful to understand, and I just think it's something we need to be mindful of as we think through the height. And because there are some things and setbacks and other things that will come into place with the density bonus if that does get used. And while I feel we got great participation from the community, that participation is only, I think, people who wanted to talk about housing, and it's a smaller number. And once people see this is coming, the larger community may have different opinions. And so I just sort of being mindful of that, I think, is useful. Thank you. My second question is, when I look, and I don't know that Lisa Porce, that you touched on this, but I may have missed it. When you talked about certainly the stepping down of the density along from sort of like Laurel Street, from El Camino down to Laurel on the west side, but it looks like we're not recommending any changes on the east side of Laurel to increase density. Is that something that came up at all to kind of maybe change that stepping, because perhaps the community is more comfortable with a little bit more density on the east side of Laurel versus, I get it, on the, don't want to go too much on the west side because you're going right into single family housing.
Right. So let me just make sure I understand your question. So, so on the west side of Laurel Street, currently we actually have two different zoning districts, east and west side of Laurel Street. So on the west side, which is adjacent to single family, is largely the MUN zoning district, is currently 20 units to the acre. So that's the area where we would double it to 40. And then the area to the right of that we would be looking at kind of like a graduated height as it moves out towards El Camino Real. So on the east side of El Camino, we would look at 50 units to the acre. And then once that particular zoning district fronts onto El Camino Real, that would jump up to potential of 120 units to the acre. But we really wanted to allow, a higher density threshold on El Camino Real mostly, and then sort of step it down as it reaches, as each zoning district kind of advances, closer to single-family residential.
Got it. And but if I understand it correctly, unless I misread in the packet, we're not talking about changing the density on the east side of Laurel, correct? That was already at 50, or is that something that we are?
Oh, correct. That's already at 50.
So I guess my question was, we looked at some of these other changes around everything else around it. Did we look at increasing the density there to, let's say, 60 or something, or was that sort of something that wasn't considered as we kind of change the stepping?
Yeah, I mean, we have the ability to change the stepping. I mean, we can look at, and see. I mean, right now, we're kind of working with the 2 case studies and sort of, again, it's a work in progress. So rather than kind of, jumping right away to increasing the density to something else, we felt let's leave it here for now. And the process is going to be iterative because we can run, certain numbers, these proposed density increases to kind of see where we land with meeting the RHNA. And if we don't need to increase the density in some locations, there's an opportunity to maybe leave that off the table. We have a future housing element cycle coming up.
Sure.
But definitely it's something that we can look at.
Okay. No, that's great. That's helpful the way you explained it. So thank you.
Thank you. Vice Mayor McDowell.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I want to thank staff for the great presentation, and I can tell that a significant amount of community outreach and feedback has already gone into this process, and I really appreciate us having this, first look at the housing element tonight. I have 2 questions, and then maybe at some point Jeff could also chime in with his big picture take on this. But my first question is, I guess I wanted to dive a little bit deeper on what you've heard from housing developers regarding multifamily housing. And do you think that increasing the density in the different proposals will help these projects pencil out and get built? And what degree of confidence do you have that making these changes will, help bring this change about? I think I'm looking for zoning that, will work to get this housing built, and it looks like we're headed in the right direction. But I guess I'm wondering, what degree of confidence do you have that, increasing the density and height will be the trick that we need?
I guess I'll start, Lisa. From what we've heard in speaking directly to the developers, we have a high degree of certainty that this is what they're asking for. That from an economic standpoint, and we have some examples in our community where we have 20 units to the acre that have not changed over for 10 or more years, because it's just not economically feasible with the construction costs and land costs and other costs for the developers. So we do have a high degree of certainty that they're telling us that this is a barrier for them. And furthermore, we are seeing some projects. We're talking to developers about projects that exceed our current densities, that they have the desire to acquire properties on El Camino, but they're kind of taking a wait and see approach with this process to see if the city's going to go in the right direction and kind of tip the scales to make it more feasible. So I think that, we know, and we've known for quite some time, that density was, it was done as an somewhat artificially, to some extent, but the intent was to limit the number of housing units in cities in the state of California, and it's been used as that tool for many years. So from an economic standpoint, we feel confident that this is a very significant step in the right direction, and you're likely to see many more developers come forward if you double your density on El Camino Real, for instance.
Okay.
I can add from the BMR ordinance perspective. So just we've been running the scenarios at different levels of units, and there's undoubtedly more feasibility the larger you go. The larger the project is, the more feasible it becomes when, you know, economies of scale and just the number of units you're able to fit on a parcel.
That's great. I'm glad you added that, Adam. I see Jeff brought his camera on. Did you want to chime in, Jeff?
I did, yeah. It seemed like you wanted my perspectives, and my perspectives on that question are probably through a different lens than Al and Lisa's and Adam's. From a less technical perspective, you know, I'm really I've through subcommittee meetings and meetings with staff and consultants seen pretty much all of this information, but it's the first time I've really seen it coalesced in the staff report and presentation and start to come together as something that the mind might begin to make, you know, to see that plan, not finished, but developing. And so I'm very encouraged by that. But I always start sort of my perspective and going back in time, just 5 or 6 years ago when we polled the community in one of our community surveys about housing, there really was not a lot of support within the community for increased housing. And it very often came up as sort of an ancillary issue with other projects and things that were going on in the community where there was pushback regarding housing. And the council, I think, very wisely recognized that, you know, they needed to do a lot more education and outreach to the community on the issue, and you all have really continued that and stepped it up the last few years, and it's you know, amazing to see the level of support have grown so much within our community for creating housing and understanding that, you know, we can't wave a magic wand and create housing. You know, that creating it means actual physical changes to the types of buildings we see in our community in terms of height and density and what that's going to mean. And there seems to be a real, you know, not just support within the community for housing, but a much more sophisticated understanding of, you know, what it's going to take to actually see the housing created. Because coming up with a plan, as difficult as it is to get through a planning process, is nothing compared to the difficulties of actually creating the housing. And I think folks, through participating in our process, have really grown to understand that it's not the city that builds this housing. It's private investment that's going to build 2,700 units. You know, the city might be involved in a small fraction of those units, but it's going to be that private investment that really you know, makes or breaks the success of this initiative in our community and any community in our region in terms of developing that housing. And the approach in the presentation tonight, I think, did a really good job of focusing on, you know, what those obstacles are and what tools the city council has to help remove those obstacles. Because what you're doing is you want to encourage housing development. And I've seen tonight a number of those tools laid out in the presentation, and I'm very excited to imagine a San Carlos that has those tools in its toolkit to be able to see the needed and necessary housing brought to our community to address this issue, and really done so in a way that will make it part of our community, because the council has other values that we heard expressed in the presentation tonight about inclusion and diversity and, community and those kinds of things. And, those are all really going to be key elements to, the long-term success of this, because these houses aren't going to get built in just a few year period. This is going to be really the beginning of a new era in our community in terms of building housing. And, if we're successful in achieving it along with our other core values, I think there will be a real satisfaction in the community about housing and how it's folded into the community makeup and becomes part of the fabric of the community. And it's not, someplace else that doesn't feel like San Carlos. And I think we're very much on the right track. I definitely look forward to the rest of the process unfolding and coming back and being able to present additional data and have a really robust conversation with the council and your commissions as this process moves to completion next year. Does that sum it up for you?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate you weighing in, Jeff. Thank you. And I think that segues into my second question quite nicely, actually, because you talked about the tools that are at our disposal as a city. So I'm wondering, what tools do we have where we could require developers of large commercial projects to actually build housing instead of writing a check for our commercial linkage fees? And I think we alluded to that in the vision plan already, because it's called direct provision. And so since we're talking about housing tonight, I'm wondering if anyone has some initial thoughts on the tools that we could use there.
If you want to start, or I can take that question.
I think we can both handle it. I'll just start quickly. Development agreements allow the council a lot of latitude in terms of negotiating for specific things that you'd like to see that you might not be able to ask for in other contexts. And the idea of asking a developer to build housing in your community is not it's not a brand new idea. It's definitely achievable. I had a lot of conversations today about that, and I think there are definitely ways to achieve that. It's a partnership, so I can only sort of speak from our side of the equation. We'll have to be talking to the developer partner, and not all developers are created equal in their access to resources and capital and those kinds of things, and not all development projects are of the same size and scale. But I think probably the most important thing that you're going to do in making that achievable is this housing element, because by addressing the issues of height and density, you're making it more economically feasible to build housing, and you're also making it more cost efficient to build housing, particularly at the scale you need to meet your RHNA numbers. And so making these changes will be critical, I think, to the viability of that concept. And then working specifically with developers to identify sites and possibilities. We probably, especially when you're talking about commercial developers, probably know more about the community and sites that have been identified and targeted in the past for housing in our community that we can share with developers, and even in cases where we can put them together. And I know some of those conversations are actually already taking place in our community between developers, and that the staff has been involved in trying to help make those linkages. Al, you want to add some to that?
I think you really got it. It's where it needs somewhere to go. The housing needs somewhere to go. It's the capability of the developer to do it, and it's the constraints. So those are. Thank you for reiterating that, Jeff. And then finally, when you negotiate these development agreements, as you mentioned, as we were discussing in the other plan, the East Side plan, it's really a matter of balance and priorities for the council. You will have the ability to decide strategically what is important at that time with a particular developer at a particular point in time. So if you weight your community benefits more in housing or more in somewhere else, you have the capability to do that with each of these development agreements. So your commercial linkage fee is simply a starting point.
That's great. Thank you. I see Greg has his camera on. Did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think I just would want to, from the legal side of this, the The linkage fee just is based upon a nexus study and the impacts from individual projects, and that study created that connection between the impacts from the projects. So in order to create an ordinance or a law that would do something similar to the development agreement process that Al and Jeff are talking about, we would have to have a study that would create the direct impact from the development to the need for them to actually build the housing, which I'm not aware of any cities that have done that, but I'm glad to look at that to see if there's a way to do that. And I guess I could envision a hypothetical, that years and years ago, companies would build housing for their employees. It wasn't from a government requirement. It was by necessity to house their employees in different environments where they were working. So there may be a way to do it, but again, I haven't seen cities that have gone in that direction. But glad to look at that for you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I appreciate the time.
Thank you. Well, and thank you to staff for the very thorough presentation, very informative. I appreciate that. And I recognize that we're very early in the journey. Also appreciate the community coming forward and participating in the process, and my colleagues' inquiry on this very important topic. So I just want to circle back on some of the themes that were already raised earlier in the discussion, and that is around kind of getting to kind of the fundamental need that we have in our community in terms of the creation of affordable housing. And what I'd like to better understand is it sounds like we have participated with developers and talked to them to some degree. I recognize that zoning and other ordinances create conditions that can either create a pathway towards development or create a barrier to that. And it often comes down to a small line, for example, in our code or ordinance. And so I'm wondering and hoping that there'll be perhaps very thorough discussions with developers to understand what are the precise conditions that need to be in place for them to really feel motivated to work in San Carlos. And I have some concerns around the size of the parcels that was brought up earlier. Councilmember Collins talked about the depth of some of these areas. When we look at the areas where the land is potentially going to be increased in terms of numbers of dwellings, it's kind of a narrow strip. And when I look at other projects across the peninsula, there's often a much larger footprint that allows for greater amenities. So Lisa or Al or Jeff, could you talk to what work is planned to really have a sit down with the developer community to understand what is currently not working in our set of rules and what needs to change in order for them to be inspired to build what I would call affordable housing in our community, right? And we know we can get market rate housing, but how do we get that affordable rate housing?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. We are continuing on to have these discussions through this process, and we have the good fortune to be able to meet with developers because some of them are doing development in our community, and so we're continuing to have these discussions, and we've talked to. As part of this process, we talked to both for-profit and non-profit housing developers about this issue, and as noted, we're having that dialogue as we go forward, and so we kind of know what some of the big issues are. We found some things that are pretty interesting, I think, even for the development community. I think we touched on things like parking earlier. Parking may be more of a cost issue than it is anything else. It makes more of an impact to them as a cost issue. But so we do continue to have those discussions and with both groups. And frankly, there's a big difference between the way they fund projects. So it's almost like a completely different culture. It's culturally different because the financing techniques for affordable housing and for-profit housing are much different. Some of the things that a for-profit housing developer would do, a nonprofit housing developer can't do because of constraints around the people who lend them money or give them tax credits and things like that. So that's an area that's new to us, I think, that we've learned recently. So I think to reassure you that we're continuing to have these discussions. And in fact, I mean, at some point, it might not be a good idea to just have some developers address the council in some way to give it, give them their opinions directly to you.
Great, thank you. And then my next question is, I want to build on something Councilmember Rack said, as well as City Manager Jeff Maltby. And that is, I again, I'm very grateful for the people who have been participating in this process. I think, similar to the Eastside development, these changes that we're going to likely be making will be transformational for San Carlos in many ways. And so to that end, with respect to the fact that many community members, have articulated their desire to see us act quicker and more swiftly with respect to, creating conditions in which affordable housing can be made. I also recognize, to Councilmember Rack's point of view, that there could be community members who are not necessarily participating and are, when these projects were to start, right, would, express some concerns. And there was a really well done spotlight that was done previous this year. Could you describe a little bit about what communications are planned as you get closer to having more specific details around changes in the zoning that would help the community understand, what might be coming in San Carlos in the future? And I'm not sure who to direct this question to, but whoever feels most comfortable.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Lisa, could you try that question?
Sure. And I think this is great that you brought that up. And certainly having the study session tonight is an opportunity to get that communication, a dialogue going with the community. Because while this is a city council study session, we did reach out to our kind of our email distribution list. The folks have been following and participating in the process. Not just those folks, but also using our social media toolkit to get the word out and updating our website and those sorts of things. But one of the things that tools that the city has that works very well is the Spotlight newsletter. And we can certainly do another Spotlight newsletter and have a conversation about how we're meeting our housing needs. And after a lot of research, and working with community at these workshops, here's kind of the direction that we're going. And then encourage them to, those who haven't been engaged to kind of get plugged in as we move forward, because we've got a whole other year left to go. And now's the time, to really kind of, take part and of the housing element if they haven't already. So that's something that we actually haven't talked about yet because we're so engrossed in the work. But once we kind of get to a point where we're ready to kind of, daylight this, I mean, we're daylighting it now, but again, there's more refinement to be done. That we would be a great idea to do a Spotlight newsletter as a way of letting the community know what our plans are.
Thank you. All right, I see Councilmember Collins' hand is up, and then assuming there's no further questions, we'll go to public comment.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just a brief comment. The staff has just done a wonderful job. This is very thorough, but really what I wanted to say is that I want to commend my colleagues for really focusing on this. I've felt like I was sort of banging my head against a wall for 8 years on the housing issue. And because we've been spending so much time on it lately, I think everybody's realizing what a very complex and interconnected issue this really is and how much work there is to do on it. And that there's many ways to solve not only affordable housing and housing in general. And it also is helping us also see how we fit in with the bigger picture since we live in the 5th largest metropolitan area of the country. So I just want to say I am pleased and encouraged that I think we're finally making some real progress towards understanding how deep and complex this problem is. So kudos to everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, Crystal, are there any members of the public who wish to make comments?
Yes, we do have a few hands up. There's 5 hands up at the moment. Moose M, you're first up, followed by David Tusman.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, council members. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, this is Mark Olbert under his nom de guerre of Moose M. Good evening, Mayor Parma Lohan and the rest of the council. I have a question and a comment. First, the question. What is the source of the 2,735 units in San Carlos's RHNA number? Specifically, is it based on the anticipated nearly 10,000 jobs that will be coming to San Carlos once the numerous biotech projects are built out? My understanding is the current RHNA number does not reflect most of that increase. If so, relying on those numbers could be dangerous. Second, the comment. Ms. Porras made a very important point, which is worth emphasizing. It is not the job of the city to build the assigned housing units, but it is the city's job to establish the policies so that the market can deliver those units when they are needed. Given the breadth and depth of the housing crisis, it is clear many units are needed and nowhere near enough have been built. Some San Carlos residents, I'm sorry to say, are starting to rise up in anger about Sacramento interfering with local control over housing policy. Worse yet, I fear it will not take much for them to focus their anger on the council for failing in its duty to the community and thereby forcing Sacramento to act instead. I truly hope that doesn't happen. It will take creative, assertive leadership and a willingness to do things differently than has been done in the past. I was very gratified to hear new ideas being considered tonight. I strongly encourage you to pursue all of those and more. This problem is so big and past practice has failed us so badly that nothing less will do. Thank you.
Thank you. So Jeff and Al, I know you addressed this question earlier because it came up from one of our council members with respect to the jobs forecast in the near term versus the longer term. Could you please reiterate your answer from previous questioning? Thank you.
Lisa, could you talk about how RHNA looked at jobs housing?
Yes. One of the things that goes into the, I think it's called the blueprint. So there's a plan and it's really in response to SB 375 from years ago, the Sustainable Community Strategies. So, and the transportation plan. So those need to be, planned together. And so one of the things that goes into the consideration of the forecasting, the future forecasting, is evaluation of the city's general plans. So if one were to look at our general plan and look at the anticipated amount of build out in office, commercial, and industrial, there's a certain number in the general plan, and I have it somewhere, but not off the top of my head. But just suffice to say that what goes into the planning of that does take into the consideration of the amount of job growth expected in different cities across these different jurisdictions. So our general plan goes to the year 2030, and we do have a build out figure for commercial, industrial, and commercial, industrial, and office space, as well as for housing. So this is some of the work that Al alluded to early in the conversation. We're kind of taking a closer look at the development that's coming in now as compared to what we forecasted it might be when the 2009 general plan was updated. So we have an overall, kind of horizon line for that. And the housing element, as I mentioned before, is a little bit different. If we took our 2735 and multiplied it by 3, which covers 3 housing element cycles, taking us to the year 2047, we get over 8,000. We'd have like over, I think it's maybe 8,200 RHNA count for that. And I understand the concern is that, you know, I guess the expectation or the assumption that a lot of this development, you know, proposed now is going to be built, you know, much quicker than, you know, the like three housing element cycles from now. So I guess that's a long-winded way to address the question. But the final blueprint and the jobs and housing forecast that went into the methodology did look at city's general plan build out horizons. And then colleagues want to add anything to that?
No, the answer is yes, it did.
Okay. Thank you both. All right, Crystal, is there another person in the queue?
Yes, we have 5 more at the moment. David Tusman, you're up next, followed by Tony Barlick.
Hello, my name is David Tusman. I'm a resident of San Carlos. Thanks so much for the presentation. I'm really glad to see that we're aiming for 30% over our RENA allocation for affordable units and acknowledge the reality that the number of units that actually get built is going to be much less than what our zoning technically allows for. So RENA is really a minimum, it's a floor to aim for, should go higher. Also note that objective 2 of RENA includes the goal to protect environmental resources. An important way to work towards that is to reduce or eliminate parking minimums, not just to, it's great if it can create more units, absolutely, or bring the cost down of units, but you know, building more car infrastructure is not helping us towards our climate goal, and it just incentivizes more driving and more car purchases. I'm really curious when staff is going to present to the community scenarios where we expand the area where we allow multifamily housing. I feel like we're working with our hand tied behind our back when the vast majority of our residential land only allows for 1 single detached unit on each plot. It's really inefficient and hurts the aims of achieving our RENA goals. Also interested for the staff to incorporate the East Side Vision Plan with the housing element, which has been raised often in the East Side Vision Plan workshops, but it's just no housing is being considered there. And the timing of when that vision plan is finalized versus when the calculation will be made to potentially show that just putting it in this concentrated downtown area isn't enough. It's going to be too late. I liked Mr. Savé's point that zoning is artificial. I think it's really important to remember that it was created just 70 years ago by people to artificially constrain how much housing we can build. And I know that the city itself doesn't create housing, but it has copious tools to slow down and hinder the creation of housing, zoning or parking requirements or discretionary review. So it's something important to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Next up is Tony Barlick, followed by Debbie.
Yeah, this is Tony Barlick. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Great. I've been operating and working in San Carlos for the last 25 years. San Carlos is known as a city of good living. And one thing that I notice about this whole meeting, that there's almost no opposition to this high density housing. City of San Carlos is more of a bedroom community. I like San Carlos because it is, it's easy to get around. There's not a lot of traffic. There is a lot of traffic now, and I can see with building all this high density housing, we're not going to be living in the city of good living, but probably Hong Kong or New York. I really don't like it. Again, there's no opposition. It feels to me like it is Sacramento and the governor that's trying to dictate our community and how it's supposed to be here. There's plenty of room in California. Why it has to be here in San Carlos, I don't know. But when it comes time to vote for city council, I'm going to vote for somebody who has a backbone to stand up against some of this high density housing that I'm really not in favor of. And I know I'm not alone when I say this. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Tony.
Next up is Debbie, followed by David Crabb.
Thank you, council members. This is Debbie Baldacchi. I'm a San Carlos resident, and I have two issues that I'd like to raise tonight. One is transparency. I'd like to thank Council Member Rack for pointing out that the community in these housing workshops were enthusiastic about 75-foot height limits, but with bonus density, they will be closer to 90. And I think if you do publicize this, please tell the city members in advance, hey, if you agree to 75, it could be 90, just to let everyone know that those are the minimum and the maximum so they aren't disappointed. An example of that was Black Mountain, when the amount that was in the first EIR was in the 50s, and then the second with bonus density was near 90. So that creates unrealistic expectations in the community. Just tell them what is coming. And number two, environmental issues. We're really near Smith Slough, and Pulgas Creek, as I've mentioned before, empties into Smith Slough. And our climate mitigation and adaptation plan has talked about the importance of the environment, setbacks from the creek, for example. And it was disappointing to see that CEQA is viewed as an impediment to housing. And environmental issues, protection of the environment, should not be secondary to providing high-density housing. The third point I would make is that in the housing presentations, Al Savay did a very good job on showing different scenarios where high-density housing could be built with spacing that looked very attractive and came in at 75 feet. So thank you for those workshops and allowing us the opportunity to participate. And thank you for all the work you do for us.
Thank you.
Next up is David Crabb, followed by Dimitri.
Good evening, council members. Dave Crabb here. I have been in contact with you over several different letters, I believe, about the disconnect between all the commercial development on the east side and the housing element that we're doing now. Kind of reflects some of the comments we've had already in terms of, I don't know, did I catch Lisa Porras correct? Did she say that the old general plan anticipated 8,000 jobs in the next 10 years? I hope I got that right. It was either 8,000 jobs or 8,000 housing units. In either case, that's far more than 2,700 units of housing based on either jobs or on housing units. And we seem to keep continuing to approve these commercial projects without realizing the impact on housing. Why don't we think about slowing down the commercial development? San Carlos needs commercial development, but it may not need this much commercial development. There is a balance somewhere. And if you don't want to have 10-story buildings or whatever along El Camino Real, the reason we're looking at that is because we're developing all these new jobs in this area. And it's not just San Carlos. Every city along the peninsula is pretty much doing it. And neither one is helping the other ones out. We can look to Belmont, or maybe Belmont's not a good example, but San Carlos, Redwood City, and say, well, they'll give us the housing that we need. They're already buried. They can't meet their own housing elements at this point. And so figuring this is going to be a regional question is not really a good answer. Plus, we do need more affordable housing because I believe like 90% of the people who work in San Carlos actually commute in from outside, and it'd be nice to have some balance in terms of people working here and actually living here. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. We have two hands left. Dimitri, followed by Tim Hilborn.
Yes, hi. Can folks hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Hi. I want to thank staff for the presentation and for the perspectives that folks have brought to this meeting in public comment. I agree with a number of the perspectives that our residents have brought up. The couple of things that I want to sort of focus on in the meetings with the community where we were, just sort of discussing like the trade-offs with density and height. There were maybe 50 to 70 or so folks representing. So I think we have to be careful about, if that truly reflects consensus amongst the community overall. So I do appreciate Council Member Rack's comments on that. I think that's a good insight. And I also think that, there is an opportunity here. This is really hard. We're trying to, thread the needle and come up with a good balance. One thing that I thought was quite interesting was if we think about total number of units and reduce the actual size of them and build more studio 1-bedrooms, we could kind of achieve multiple goals, which are build units without having to go too high and really change the character of the community. So I think, really thinking that through is really important. And lastly, for the giant Alexandria, complex, I truly do feel we, as a community, we should figure out what levers we can use to have them help out with some potential housing as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri.
Thank you. Next up is Tim Hilborn, followed by Sonia Elks.
Okay, City Council and staff, thank you very much for the presentation. Appreciate it. First of all, a couple things on the presentation about SB 9 and SB 10. About 70% of Californians who were polled are against both of those bills. A couple things about SB 9. It's not 4 units, it's actually 8 units that can be developed on a split lot. To split the lot, however, the owner has to pay off their mortgage. So we're going to see developers coming in and splitting those lots and putting developments there, not the owners, because most people do not have their mortgage paid off and they won't. SB 10 allows 10-unit apartment complexes in single-family neighborhoods, and that if the City Council approves that, and it takes away the initiative process, and there's no recourse for the community to do anything about it. So I'm completely against Sacramento doing this. We need local control. We have a jobs, housing imbalance. We don't have a housing crisis. And I asked the City Council decades ago, post redevelopment, to work with other cities to get better tax pass-through for residential versus commercial. Right now, 17% of our commercial is paying 80% of the city revenue or close to that. We need not just a fee structure, but we also need more taxes coming from the commercial and industrial. For the Alexandria project, why can't we have their 8-story parking lot be an 8-story housing complex? I just don't see the balance that we have. We need to fix the balance. We need to stop the commercial development. We need to get housing in here, not along El Camino, not 90-foot. That's way too much density. And we're going to be facing ongoing construction. And the last thing I'm going to say is, once you start going up, how is the City Council and the city staff going to watch out that they're not doing short-term rentals like they did at the Transit Village? So we just really need to stop the commercial development and get money and make these commercial developers help out with the housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Next up is Sonia Elks, followed by Elmer Martinez.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I'm a big fan of density in housing and smart density where it doesn't fill up our streets with more vehicles. I do like lots of neighbors nearby, and I wanted to make sure that that I made that clear. But I want to also make sure that our streets stay open and not congested. And if we put in more density along the transit corridor, it's a fantastic opportunity to also move along this project, the Grand Boulevard project, where El Camino has to become more transit and bike lane and also move vehicles along, but just a more multimodal street so that we can have this density and also move people around efficiently without everyone needing to have their own giant vehicle. So those are my main points. The Grand Boulevard Initiative, El Camino, along with all of the density that's coming, which I think is fantastic, as long as we can also keep our streets moving. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you, Sonia. And last we have Elmer Martinez. Elmer, you should be able to unmute. There you go.
My apologies. Good evening, Council. I just wanted to convey my comments that I agree with Mr. Tasman and the folks who are bringing a perspective that you all should be considering more housing on the east side, but also looking at multifamily housing between Laurel and El Camino as well. With the RENA numbers that are being considered for the next 4 years, you should be just looking at the data that support more housing in that region. So just wanted to throw my perspective in here, and thank you for the city staff for all the work you're doing. Thank you again.
Thank you, Elmer.
Thank you, Elmer. There are no further hands.
Thank you, Crystal. So we'll move to discussion. Councilmember Rack.
Thank you. I'll go first this time, Madam Mayor. I want to thank all the public for their comments, and I also want to thank Ron for his comments about this council coming together around housing, and that we're finally seeing things moving that maybe perhaps previous councils weren't as active on. So thank you, Ron, for that comment. And I do agree it's been a priority and something we've been working on diligently. And I'm looking forward to the BMR ordinance coming in and for the next steps in this progress. I think this was really helpful to get. And I just wanted to sort of make a comment around John's comments around the affordable housing piece, because I agree with you, John, that what the state is, I think the RENA process, the way it's laid out, is flawed, and the state is not really doing their job around affordable housing. And that's where we can build our way out of above market units, but until the state steps up and provides some funding for housing, we're never going to be able to get out of this crisis and be able to get the affordable housing that we need in San Carlos, in the county, and in the state. And so, it's frustrating to see that there's sort of this other things around like SB 9, SB 10, and others that are happening when the real crisis and real issues at hand is sort of being ignored and not dealt with. So I appreciate, John, you bringing that up, and I'm hoping that sort of the state will look at how they can help us out at the local level with affordable housing. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Anyone else? Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I wanted to just build on Adam's comments. I'm proud that housing has been a top priority for this council, and it has been since day one for us. And I also appreciate that staff has brought this update to us this evening. I think it's really helpful for me to hear what the community is comfortable with regarding height, and to see the maps in the staff report of where existing higher density housing can be increased. And it looks like from what we have heard from staff tonight that there is a reasonable amount of confidence that this plan and the changes we make to zoning will bring about more housing projects, which is great. I know that the jobs coming to the east side of San Carlos has really brought to the fore for many community members the need for more housing in our community. And I do want San Carlos to be part of the solution to the jobs housing balance. And I recognize that we need to work on both sides of the equation. For me, what struck me in the staff report is the fact that only 16% of the city's land area is zoned for commercial and industrial uses. And also the commercial and retail sector on our east side produces over 80% of the city's retail sales taxes, as well as skilled labor jobs and products and services for local residents and our region. So we can't have a city that is 100% residential. And I think that jobs and industry on our east side are important. And we need to ensure that there's just an appropriate mix of jobs and housing. And for me, that means housing that is not just studio apartments, but also housing with 2 and 3 bedrooms where families can live in our community. The cost of developing housing is high, which is why I mentioned at the beginning of our meeting the 100% affordable housing project in San Mateo, which will cost $170 million to build 225 units. So I am looking for creative solutions to drive the needed housing forward. And so I hope that we can zero in on what is already included in the vision plan, which is the reference to direct provision of affordable housing, meaning that we use the tools we have available to ensure that large developers of commercial space either build or partner with a developer or nonprofit to build the housing to directly address the jobs housing balance in real time. I also think that it's really important that our work on housing and jobs, and also traffic and circulation for that matter, does not occur in silos, and that we have these conversations concurrently, and that we're continuing to look holistically at our community. Those are my comments, Madam Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Collins and then Councilmember Duke.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I also want to thank the members of the public who spoke tonight. We heard a variety of opinions, and it really just highlights how complex and how difficult the housing issue is around here. But I would like people to understand that we don't have the luxury of using the Nancy Reagan strategy of just say no. We just can't say no to development. We just can't say no to housing. We just can't say no to more jobs. Those are happening. We live in a major metropolitan area, as I pointed out before. People need to understand that the solutions to the issues that we face are very complex. They're very difficult. And if people really want to change what's going on, the change really needs to happen in Sacramento. You would need to elect different leaders, but I would say this, be careful what you wish for. We have a lot of problems that we have had to deal with in this town for a long time. Trying to solve the housing issue is just one of them. And if we don't solve it, then we are going to, or if we refuse to solve it, really, that's a better way to put it. If we refuse to solve this issue, it will be solved by people who will solve it in a way that is beyond our control. And that's why I say we need to be careful what we wish for. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Collins. Councilmember Dugan.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. I appreciate that. And I also appreciate all the staff's work on, it's a very complex issue. And as you do get into it, you do realize the complexities of it. So Ron, I appreciate how you highlight that. And I also really appreciate all the public's input through our community outreach and this evening. And we need that, and we need more of that. We have a lot of important decisions to make as a city, and we definitely need to be hearing from all the various views, because these are very impactful decisions that are going to affect the trajectory of San Carlos for a long time. But I do really appreciate my colleagues and this council. We are taking housing very seriously, and I think we are stepping up to what is going to be required of us as a city and as a council. And Ron, thank you for painting some of the history on that. I appreciated that. As far as density goes, it is a tough issue. I mean, it's I said this many times talking to folks. I love the character and charm of San Carlos. It's been wonderful to my family for the 18 years we've lived in town. But I have 3 children, and I have to ask, where can they live someday? And where can, their teachers live, and our firemen and other essential workers? So in my view, that's really the crux of it. We all love San Carlos and what it offers, but we have to be a vibrant, welcoming community as well. And I want to know, where can my kids live someday? That's still an open question, I think, for far too many of us here in town. And so I'm glad we're taking this seriously. And as we think about density, the question is, in my view, where? And I hope SB9 does not become a significant distraction in us having these conversations, because I think we do have a lot of areas where density is warranted. I really like staff's work on El Camino and elsewhere in our core. I think there are opportunities on the east side as well, and I hope we continue to be open-minded and consider that. Because as we've looked at these numbers and we just see how aggressive the RHNA numbers are, and yet they still fall very short. We historically have achieved 9% as a percentage of essential housing versus market rate. Maybe that'll be 15% if we keep doing things as we've been doing them. To keep up with what our regional processes determine we need, that needs to be 50%. We should all accept that as the significant challenge that it is, and really hold that thought as we consider these new policies. We're doing the right things. We're updating the below market rate ordinance. So, we're going to have to take a hard look at how we do that. We're in the middle of that East Side Vision Plan. I think housing has to be an element of that plan for us to get anywhere near these numbers. I think staff was looking for perhaps a little bit of guidance from us on if we're comfortable with that buffer number. And I would just say, even with that 50% affordable to market rate, that is with a 30% buffer. So, I'll just throw it out there. We might want to consider going with a higher buffer than that in the hopes of ending up with more than 15% affordable housing and closer to the 50%. So just very, very important issue. And I'm glad this council takes it seriously, and I'm glad that the public is as involved as they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Dugan. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the rest of the council comments this evening and the public participating in the discussion. Since I've lived in San Carlos, I've seen it change dramatically, and I recognize and appreciate the change is difficult. The circumstances of our economy bring both great opportunity, but also great challenges. I know and believe that by working together, we'll be able to figure this very complicated situation out. I believe the comments made about the financing and the economics. I believe for a long time that is really at the root of all of this, and I think continuing to work across the community to understand what conditions we can create to make the creation of affordable housing viable is an important one that I'd like us to continue to have. In my recent conversations with people who serve our community, it's not lost on me that there's actually very few members of our public safety team, both police and fire, that live here in San Carlos. If there is a major disaster, they will have to come from a long distance, often over a bridge, and several hours drive from our community. It's not lost on me that in our schools, which are great, the turnover with respect to our teachers is often driven by the cost of living in our community. And our civil servants are also challenged with the ability to live in the community within which they work. I want to be a part of a community where the people that I count on daily for my cup of coffee or dry cleaning or public safety can afford to live in our community. And I would, as we move forward in this process, I'd like to challenge ourselves, to consider that jobs forecast for our local community and whether or not those target numbers for housing units are aggressive enough. I also appreciate the concept that was forwarded earlier, that we also look at the mix and breadth of the types of housing, not just focus on studio and one-bedroom apartments. I would like the housing stocks to work for everyone, regardless of their journey in their respective life, and we know that their needs for housing change over the course of their life. So with that, again, I very much appreciate the conversation, and I do look forward to future discussions on this and hope staff will come back with frequent updates for us on this, as it is very important to council and the community. So with that, I propose a 10-minute break. Are there any objections? All right.
None whatsoever.
All right. Seeing none, we'll be back at 9:38. Thank you so much, everybody. Crystal, if we can resume our discussion.
Yes, we're ready on our side.
Terrific. Okay. So the next item is item 8B, study session. Receive a presentation on Senate Bill 1383, short-lived climate pollutants, organic waste methane emissions reduction. And giving the presentation this evening is Stephen Machida, Public Works Director. And I understand he has a number of people with him this evening. So welcome, Stephen.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and City Council members. Stephen Machida, Public Works Director. So tonight's study session, what we're going to really talk about is Senate Bill 1383. And essentially this bill was established to combat short-lived climate pollution, mainly from methane emissions, mainly from food waste or the disposal of food waste, yard waste, and paper products. So tonight you're actually going to receive two presentations. The first presentation will be given by Ms. Tracy Webb from Cal Recycle, and she will describe really at a high level the requirements of the bill. With Ms. Webb, there's Kenneth E. and Carla Miller will be present to help answer any questions. The second presentation will be actually presented by Mr. TJ Carter from Rethink Waste, who will actually describe what the 11-member agencies of SBWA together will tackle the requirements of SB 1383. And also with TJ is Mr. Joe Lamariana, as well as Julie Au. So one of the last things I wanted to just mention is this kind of the first of several items that we're going to be bringing back to council over the next few months to really address some of the requirements of in this bill, SB 1383. But with that, I'd like to turn this over to Tracy.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for inviting us. I'm going to be turning my camera off while I'm presenting. Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and Council members. Thank you for inviting us to present on SB 1383. My name is Tracy Webb, and I am the city's local assistance and market development liaison. This presentation provides a very high-level overview of the requirements for compliance with 1383. Next slide, please. Why is 1383 important? Organic waste comprises half of California's waste stream. Food waste comprises 13% of the state's disposed waste. This is all happening while 1 in 5 children go hungry every night in California. Next slide, please. SB 1383 passed in 2016 as part of California's larger strategy to combat climate change. The law was designed to reduce global warming superpollutants like methane, which is up to 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Landfills are one of the largest producers of methane in the state. As we know, when organic material breaks down in the landfill, methane is generated. So we need to move away from landfilling organic waste like food, paper, and yard waste. Next slide, please. SB 1383 sets a statewide target that requires California to reduce organic waste disposal by 75% and increase edible food recovery by 20% by 2025. Organic waste is defined broadly in the regulations and includes food waste, paper, cardboard, green waste, organic textiles and carpets, lumber, wood, biosolids, manure, and sludges. Cal Recycle collaborated with jurisdictions and other stakeholders over the past 3.5 years to complete the regulations that became final November 3rd, 2020. While the regulations take effect in 2022, jurisdictions have to plan now so they can be compliant by January 1st, 2022. Next slide, please. There are many benefits if we successfully implement California's super pollutant reduction strategy, including environmental benefits, such as fighting climate change, improved air quality, and less landfilled waste, providing millions of meals to Californians without enough to eat, and creating thousands of new green jobs. Next slide, please. Here are some key implementation dates. The The most important date to note is January 1st, 2022, when the regulations become enforceable. This means starting January 1st, 2022, jurisdictions must have programs in place, and CalRecycle can begin enforcement actions on jurisdictions and other entities. In 2024, jurisdictions will be required to take enforcement action against non-compliant entities. Next slide, please. This slide provides a brief overview of the program requirements that jurisdictions will be required to adequately staff and resource. We will briefly cover some of these requirements in the next few slides. Jurisdictions will be required to provide organic waste collection services to all residents and businesses. This is what we refer to as automatically providing service or universal service. The resident or business is automatically provided the service rather than subscribing to it. The regulations standardize container colors across the state to be fully implemented by January 1st, 2036, and require a jurisdiction to place a label on each new container or lid provided to generators starting January 1st, 2022. Jurisdictions can issue 3 types of waivers to generators: de minimis, physical space, and collection frequency. The regulations also place requirements on residents and commercial businesses. Jurisdictions must conduct annual education and outreach to all generators. This includes information on methods for the prevention of organic waste generation, recycling organic waste on site, and sending organic waste to community composting. This also includes information regarding programs for the donation of edible food. Jurisdictions must procure certain levels of recovered organic waste products, compost, renewable gas, or electricity. From biomass conversion. Each jurisdiction will have a minimum procurement target based on its population. There are also requirements to purchase recycled content paper and paper products if price and performance is comparable. CalRecycle will notify jurisdictions of their target prior to January 1st, 2022. Each jurisdiction must plan for adequate capacity for recycling organic waste and edible food recovery. Each county will lead this effort by coordinating with cities, special districts that provide solid waste collection services, and regional agencies located within the county. Jurisdictions must monitor compliance and conduct enforcement. Monitoring begins in 2022. Jurisdictions must do an annual compliance review of commercial businesses to make sure that they have service. There are contamination monitoring requirements for the contents of the containers. To reduce reporting, jurisdictions are required to maintain records and keep information in an implementation record. Each jurisdiction is required to report to the department annually on its implementation and compliance with the requirements of 1383. Requirements include adopting an ordinance or enforceable mechanism consistent with the regulatory requirements by January 1st, 2022. Next slide, please. Thank you. SB 1383 extends beyond directing waste management and recycling operations and staff. This slide shows that every department within local government will be affected and have a role to play. Each department will need to understand how SB 1383 impacts their work. Jurisdictions should be thinking and planning for the staffing they will need, whether they will task their direct service providers to staff some activities, and whether they will contract with other entities, such as environmental health inspectors or consultants. Next slide, please. Jurisdictions are responsible to implement edible food recovery programs in their communities. This includes providing education and outreach, assessing capacity of existing edible food recovery, and expanding existing infrastructure if necessary. conducting inspections of Tier 1 commercial edible food generators and food recovery organizations and services beginning 2022, and inspections of Tier 2 commercial edible food generators beginning January 1st, 2024. SB 1383 related inspections of food recovery organizations and food recovery services will be limited to verifying that the record-keeping requirements have been met. Inspections should be at a level rate to adequately determine compliance with the requirements. Annual inspections of each Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generator is not required. Beginning in 2024, jurisdictions must take enforcement action on commercial edible food generators that are out of compliance with the edible food recovery requirements. Next slide, please. By January 1st, 2022, jurisdictions are required to have an enforcement mechanism or ordinance in place. Between January 2022 and December 2023, jurisdictions need to identify businesses in violation of the regulatory requirements and provide educational material to those generators. Beginning January 2024, jurisdictions must take progressive enforcement action against organic waste generators that are not in compliance. The progressive approach allows for notification to the generator and provides time for the generator to comply before penalties are required to be issued by the jurisdiction. CalRecycle sets a maximum time frame that a jurisdiction has to issue a notice of violation and issue penalties to a generator. The jurisdiction has the flexibility to develop its own enforcement process within these parameters. An early, robust education program will minimize the amount of enforcement action needed. Also, if the jurisdiction is automatically providing service to its residents and commercial businesses, this further minimizes the need for enforcement actions. Next slide, please. In the case of entities such as public universities, school districts, federal facilities, which are exempt from local solid waste oversight, CalRecycle will be directly responsible for ensuring compliance. However, jurisdictions are required to provide education and outreach to these entities. CalRecycle will be evaluating a jurisdiction's compliance, for example, by verifying that all organic waste generators have service, jurisdictions are providing education, jurisdictions are issuing notices of a violation within the correct timeline. CalRecycle will be establishing a process for conducting jurisdiction audits. The timeline and process will be different than how it is done now. Much of a jurisdiction's existing programs will be integrated into this audit process, so you will not have separate reviews. SB 1383 sets a statewide target and not a jurisdiction organic waste diversion target. Unlike with AB 939, SB 1383 prohibits a jurisdiction target. Due to this structure, the regulations require a more prescriptive approach and establishes state minimum standards. Jurisdictions will have to demonstrate compliance with each of the prescriptive standards rather than a determination of a good faith effort. Under the regulations, if CalRecycle determines a jurisdiction is violating one or more of the requirements, CalRecycle will provide compliance assistance such as checklists, model tools, and training. Although CalRecycle may begin penalty enforcement on regulated entities starting January 1st, 2022, the timelines for the enforcement process are not triggered until CalRecycle issues a notice of violation. Once CalRecycle determines enforcement actions or penalties are necessary, CalRecycle will implement the process outlined in SB 1383. Next slide, please. CalRecycle is helping jurisdictions in a number of ways, including the 4 model tools. These include Model Franchise Agreement, Model Mandatory Organics Disposal Reduction Ordinance, Model Organic Waste Product Procurement Policy, and Model Edible Food Recovery Agreement. The R3 Local Jurisdiction Service Rate Study, which provides guidance on setting organics recycling rates, was made available to jurisdictions in early March. We also have case studies of jurisdictions that have set rates, funded infrastructure, and educated the public and elected officials. A best management practices guidance document for identifying tier 1 and 2 commercial edible food generators, and we released the procurement calculator tool and held an accompanying webinar to help jurisdictions plan and track procurement activities. Other recently published tools include, for regional agencies, we developed model language for amending the JPA to address 1383 requirements that the JPA will be taking on. We developed the organic waste and edible food recovery calculator tools to help with the capacity planning requirements and held a webinar to cover this guidance. We also released a survey tool that jurisdictions can use to gather, to gather information from food recovery organizations and services regarding capacity. We developed department-issued waiver forms for jurisdictions that are eligible to apply for a waiver. CalRecycle will send out a listserv message once they start accepting applications. We developed a new technology review process and application. CalRecycle will send out a listserv message once they start accepting applications. We have other tools that are scheduled to be released soon. To help jurisdictions with maintaining records on site, we are developing a model implementation record-keeping tool. We are developing a tool for best management practices for conducting route reviews. We are developing a series of training videos to support and further develop an understanding of the regulation requirements. And CalRecycle is working with a contractor on the data research for the statewide education campaign. The focus is using community social-based marketing to drive changes in behavior. Our staff is available to help individual jurisdictions with the implementation tools. We can identify funding resources for companies that want to site or expand their recycling manufacturing operations, and we can answer questions about the regulation. If there are other tools that you need, please let us know. Next slide, please. The City of San Carlos is on its way to implementing a program that will meet SB 1383 regulations. We would like to acknowledge San Carlos for working on the following efforts in preparation for 2022. Developing an SB 1383 ordinance using the Rethink Waste model ordinance, reviewing agreement with Rethink Waste to implement SB 1383 on behalf of the city, reviewing agreement with the County of San Mateo SMC Office of Sustainability to implement an edible food recovery program, and researching SB 1383 recovered organic materials targets with SMC Office of Sustainability and Rethink Waste. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, Madam Mayor, within your indulgence, I would like to actually have TJ Carter actually do his presentation. I think TJ will actually boil down a lot of things that Ms. Webb had talked about. Will actually describe a little bit more in detail of what we're planning to do kind of here locally. So if you don't mind, I'd like to have TJ go next. So TJ.
Please.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. My name is TJ Carter. I'm the Recycling and Compliance Program Manager at Rethink Waste. I will build on the presentation from CalRecycle and discuss how we are planning for implementation of SB 1383 in the Rethink Waste service territory, which includes San Carlos. Next slide. So we are very fortunate enough to have so many great organizations involved. Under SB 1383, jurisdictions are ultimately responsible for compliance, but they may delegate some responsibilities to public or private entities. To implement SB 1383, it is expected Rethink Waste, Recology, the county's Office of Sustainability, and the city will all have a piece of SB 1383. Next slide. For the Rethink Waste service territory, we are pursuing a 3-container system for all customers. This approach you may be familiar with at the residential level with blue, green, and black carts for recycling, compost, and landfill. Next slide. So I want to touch on a few of these main SB 1383 elements important for compliance and implementation, the SB 1383 ordinance, enforcement, procurement, collection and processing, edible food recovery, and then a few items that thread in between these elements. Next slide. Rethink Waste has developed a model ordinance specific to our service territory to support our member agencies on this requirement, though there are areas in the model ordinance that the city will need to complete that is specific to San Carlos. Rethink Waste has hired a consultant who drafted our model ordinance and is available to help you customize your ordinance. And under SB 1383, the ordinance will need to be in place by January 1, 2022. Next slide. For enforcement, Rethink Waste will conduct outreach and education, help identify and educate non-compliant entities, and will pass along complaints to the jurisdiction. For the city, this includes adopting the ordinance noted in the previous slide, issuing notice of violations, and assessing penalties. There may be the need to hire additional staff or support for the enforcement program. For the edible food recovery program, the county's Office of Sustainability has offered to lead the enforcement for that piece. Next slide. There are two main aspects of procurement. The first part is under SB 1383. It requires jurisdictions to obtain recycled content paper products, including paper supplies and janitorial supplies, and maintain records for those purchases. The second part is a bit more complicated. Jurisdictions are required to procure recovered organic materials, including compost, mulch, renewable natural gas, or biomass, in amounts based on population size. So for San Carlos, we estimate roughly 1,300 tons of compost would be needed to meet this target, and costs could range from $121,000 to $345,000 annually. Rethink Waste and the County Office of Sustainability are researching options to meet these targets in cost-efficient ways. Next slide. Rethink Waste is working to scope new services with Recology for SB 1383 requirements. At a high level, we are discussing the additional organic collection, outreach and education, and cost estimates. These changes would be in the form of Amendment 2 to the franchise agreement, and we would anticipate bringing this to our member agencies in the next few months. Next slide. The county's Office of Sustainability has offered to take the lead on the edible food recovery program on behalf of jurisdictions in San Mateo County. Jurisdictions will need to adopt a memorandum of understanding with the county's Office of Sustainability for participation. Rethink Waste will support this through targeted outreach and education and capacity building support. Next slide. And then at a high level, Rethink Waste has hired contractors to help with this project, like technical assistance for the model ordinance and developing Recology's scope of services. We will take the lead on record keeping and reporting requirements and issuing waivers. We've put together a memorandum of understanding outlining all the roles and responsibilities Rethink Waste will take on behalf of our member agencies. Next slide. And then I'm happy to help answer any questions. And as Stephen noted, I'm here with the Rethink Waste our Executive Director, Joe LaMariana.
Thank you, TJ. Stephen, are there any additional reports or comments from staff?
No, that really concludes, this effort or the presentations, but, as both Tracy and TJ actually have presented, this is a very complex kind of bill and legislation. And as I mentioned earlier, you're going to see us coming back to you on several different items, to kind of get this thing underway, because we do have to have everything in place by January 1st of 2022. So with that, I think that concludes the presentation, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
All right, thank you. So we'll take questions from council and then take public comment and then come back to discussion. Are there any members of council who have questions? Councilmember Rack.
Madam Mayor, and thank you to TJ and Tracy for the presentation, and Stephen. I know it looked like you talked about sort of there's a certain amount of cost associated with this for the city, potentially hiring as well from the enforcement standpoint. And this may be for Stephen or any of you. Sort of, when do we? I know you threw some estimates out, but when do we think we'll have a better sense of when when we might see those costs come around, that we can kind of prepare for those and sort of be ready as we think through budgeting from the San Carlos side, from the city side.
So, Councilman Rack, we're still kind of going through the process. A lot of this is there's a lot of moving parts in regards to the whole bill, right? And so we're still really trying to get a handle on it. Unfortunately, it is coming on very, very quickly, as you can imagine. However, what I can say is, for the county of San Mateo and certainly with Joe and his team, TJ, we're by far well in advance in a lot of other cities within California, where we actually have moved, we're looking at the three bin cans, and at least we're somewhat familiar. And so we're probably miles ahead of many, many cities. And so, from a positive note, we're still trying to gather that information as far as, what it's going to take. But what I can say is without kind of the assistance of Rethink Waste and kind of having them take over a lot of the duties, just back of the envelope, I was kind of calculating I would need at least maybe 4 full-time people, running just this program, at least as a minimum, just to run. And that's really not including, some of the enforcement action, but just kind of taking care of the administrative stuff, items that this requires. So this is a real heavy lift for all cities. And actually by going together with Rethink Waste, certainly we're going to benefit from actually the cost, where we could actually share the costs and share the outreach and education programs that, is a requirement of this bill.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Stephen. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I see Joe LaMariana has his hand up. Joe, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, fellow council members and TAC member Machida. So nice to see everybody here tonight, and thank you for the invitation. I want to support Stephen's comment a moment ago. We're all just getting our hands around this. So as your technical resource, we are trying to present options that allow you to maximize the cost savings and cost sharing benefits of being part of a joint powers authority. That's one of the very main reasons that you choose to be part of our agency. So we take that very seriously, and we're looking at ways to constantly sort of just, distribute those costs more effectively. I would say certainly by the time you guys start putting your budgets together in the mid to late spring for the next fiscal year, the city's probably going to have a better read on that. I can tell you, we're looking at it from the agency's standpoint, and the preliminary numbers that we've looked at for our side of the house. So the operating system that handles the entire collection, processing, and sorting and transportation of the material, we're looking at probably 3 to 7% above the normal CPI indicators and adjustments. So right now we benefit by having a fixed cost contract with Recology and with South Bay Recycling, our two major partners in collecting and handling the materials. And I will say, as a comparative, Stephen was absolutely right. I just got back from an industry meeting on Friday, and I heard the County of Sacramento's implementation plans on this program. And the fact that we already have a 3-cart system is hugely beneficial already. We're looking at targeting a subset of multifamily dwelling properties and commercial properties that don't currently have it. But in their case, in Sacramento, they're looking at the entire system reboot. They're talking about hiring over 30 people. They're talking about something like 20 to 25 new routes, which means that many new trucks, et cetera. They're looking at a rate increase anywhere from 28 to 41%, depending on if they phase it or not on an annual basis. I mean, that is staggering. So with that said, I think we can feel good about this, that this is kind of in a realm of, something that's realistic. And we have to remember why we're doing this. There are significant environmental benefits to rerouting this material from landfills where they were identified as super emitters and super concentrated emitters poisonous gases that contribute to greenhouse gas, and taking the material and recovering it and reusing it at a much higher level as a soil amendment and something that's truly beneficial to the community. So those are some thoughts along those lines.
Great. Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Stephen and Joe, for that. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Any further questions from council? Councilmember Dugan.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. And yeah, just a quick question. So as we look at this model ordinance, and I realize I heard that it'll have to be customized for San Carlos, you know, in kind of the obvious ways, but is there anything less obvious as we've looked at that needs to be, you know, anything about our situation in San Carlos or our interpretation of the bill that would have us do any substantive changes from the model ordinance?
So, Councilmember Dugan, you know, yes, we have looked at it. It really is model ordinance, and the intent really is to kind of cover all 11 agencies. There are certain areas within the ordinance that you know, we really can't tinker with. It is something that, you know, the attorneys have indicated that, you know, that's what must be in the bill in order for us to comply with the 1383. There's some small areas that we might be able to amend slightly, or, you know, provide some additional guidance or receive additional guidance from. But there's not a lot of areas that we could tinker with, if you will, to really customize to San Carlos. You know, I think the end goal really is to kind of look at, you know, an ordinance that will cover all of, you know, all of our 11 member agencies.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, it doesn't appear that there's any additional questions from council. Crystal, are there any members of the public who wish to make a comment on this item?
Yes, so it looks like we have one hand at the moment. Dimitri, you should be able to unmute.
Hi, my hand must have been raised inadvertently. I don't have any comments here. I do. One quick comment is for just the waste. I appreciate the fact that we have a compost bin. Years ago, we were able to order even smaller waste, you know, bucket. It was like really tiny, and my family of 4, we were like really proud of only using that. And I'm wondering if we could encourage the smaller containers for the actual waste. But other than that, I'm sorry my hand was raised. I'm interested in the carbon emissions discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri.
Thank you. There are no further hands.
Okay. All right. Any further discussion on this item?
I just wanted to tell you thank you again for inviting us. We really appreciate it. And if you do have questions in the future, please reach out. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Councilmember Dugan, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. Yeah, just a quick comment. You know, certainly seems like a worthy objective. Mitigating climate change is one of our top goals as a city. It's been that for some time. I share Adam's concerns on costs. You know, unfunded mandates from Sacramento are, you know, not always fun to deal with. This one, you know, seems worthy, and I'm optimistic that it will further help our climate change mitigation efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe, I see you had another comment to make.
Yes, Madam Mayor, I just want to say thank you very much. And I want to acknowledge the leadership that board member and council member Rack contributes to our agency. We're thrilled to have him very involved, and he adds value at every level. The same can be said with TAC member Machida. And I know it all happens with the leadership of city manager Malpe as well. So we want to thank all of those individuals for investing the time to make our agency go and represent everyone's interest there. So good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And I see Kenneth Yee from Cal Recycle has his hand up.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and distinguished council. On behalf of CalRecycle, I just want to share our comments. We greatly appreciate the efforts that the jurisdiction, the county, as well as in your partnership with Rethink Waste, the progress that is being made and the progressiveness with moving forward for implementing 1383. We see it across the state, and as mentioned, there are a variety of places jurisdictions are at in terms of moving forward and being positioned to implement. And fortunately, your jurisdiction in its partnership with Rethink Waste is positioned very nicely. So I just want to let you know on behalf of CalRecycle, we really appreciate those efforts. We remain available. You mentioned the funding piece. As we find information about resources that are potentially available to tap into, Tracy is working closely within that discussion to shed light on those resources. And I just didn't want it to go unmentioned that there are potentially some resources that can be tapped into, and we will make sure that when they are available, we work closely with you to see what can be done to potentially tap into those. So, thanks again.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the presentation this evening, and I also want to thank council again for the early action they took. We do now have compost bins downtown, which was inspired by SB 1383. So gotten a lot of positive feedback from our community members about that. So looking forward to doing more work here. All right, well, thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to working with all of you on this. And as next steps, we'll move into item 9A, a public hearing on consideration of adopting a resolution adopting the Climate Mitigation and Adaptation Plan and Addendum number 1 to the General Plan Environmental Impact Report. Before we go here, though, I do believe we may need a motion to extend the length of the meeting.
Madam Mayor, no, go ahead, Ron.
I'm just going to say so move to 11 o'clock.
I'm not hearing a second.
I think we're going to need more time than that, unfortunately. So.
I was being optimistic.
All right. We can always keep pushing it back. So.
All right. I was thinking you wanted to go for 10:45, but all right. 11 o'clock. Crystal, do you need to call the roll for this?
Yes. I have Vice Mayor McDowell.
Yes.
Councilmember Collins.
Yes.
Councilmember Dugan.
Yes.
Councilmember Rack.
Yes.
And Mayor Palmer Lohan.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great.
All right, and I think speaking tonight is going to be Adam Lokar, Management Analyst and Sustainability Specialist. Welcome, Adam.
Great. Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council. We'll keep this presentation to 15 minutes so we can save time for questions and discussion and get through it quickly. As the Mayor mentioned, I'm Adam Lokar. I'm a Management Analyst in the City Manager's Office. Also joining me today are Tammy Seal and Eli Crispy from PlaceWorks, our consultants on this project. We're here to give you a presentation on the Climate Mitigation and Adaptation Plan for possible adoption. Here are some of the other members on the project team: Tara Peterson on the city side, Trina Wilson, Jacqueline Protzman, and Jessica Robbins on the PlaceWorks side. Next slide, please. So the CMAP, or Climate Mitigation and Adaptation Plan, is an update and expansion to the 2009 Climate Action Plan, and it ensures the city remains consistent with state regulations related to greenhouse gas reductions. So the plan includes greenhouse gas reduction goals going out through the years 2030 and 2050 with updated inventories and forecasts and identified strategies to achieve those targets. In addition, this plan goes a little bit further and recognizes the potential climate change impacts and vulnerabilities in the community, and also identifies strategies to support climate adaptation and resilience. The CMAP also provides an implementation and monitoring program to guide staff in executing the strategies, and includes an environmental review that's consistent with CEQA. Here's the layout of the document. Executive summary kind of provides an overview. The introduction describes the purpose, regulatory framework, and how the plan was prepared. The greenhouse gas emissions chapter and vulnerability to climate change chapter kind of discusses the current conditions, The greenhouse gas emissions reductions pathway and adaptation strategy chapters look at the strategies that we can deploy to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. And then it finishes with the implementation strategy. Next slide. We began this project last year, focusing initially on technical analysis in the winter. Moving into the spring, we started actually developing draft strategies. And through the summer, now we've been actually preparing the plan. And throughout this project, we've tried to provide opportunities for community engagement through different means to ensure that the CMAP is representative of the values and expectations of our community. So phase 3 is where we find ourselves now. We released the public review draft CMAP back in June. The City Council had an opportunity to review this draft version during a study session at the June 28th Council meeting and provided feedback. The project team also presented to the Planning Commission in August, where the Commission also provided comments and unanimously adopted a resolution recommending that the City Council also adopt the CMAP. Comments from both the City Council study session, the Planning Commission meeting, and various public comment that we've received have been incorporated into the CMAP before you this evening. Next slide. And with that, I'll actually hand things over briefly to Eli Crispy with PlaceWorks.
Thank you, Adam. In the CMAP document, there is a discussion of the individual strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and achieve climate adaptation. This is how they are laid out in the document. At the top is the strategy language itself. In the case of the greenhouse gas reduction policies, the level of greenhouse gas reductions achieved in 2030 and 2050 is directly below that. And that's given what we consider to be feasible levels of community participation, which are described in the technical appendix to the CMAP. Below that are the specific action items to implement the strategy. And then at the bottom are co-benefits. And these are additional benefits of importance to the community that are not directly related to greenhouse gas reductions. Since the study session back in June, the team has made some responses or some changes in response to Council's comments at that time. We have updated the job numbers to include the large increase in jobs that is expected as part of the East Side development. There is more language in the CMAP about the East Side planning efforts. There are also more details in the CMAP about how greenhouse gas reduction strategies and climate adaptation strategies should be prioritized. And we have clarified why the all-electric reach code is not treated as an existing action, even though it is already being enforced. Next slide, please. We have also added some more language around the connection between the housing supply and greenhouse gas emission reductions, as has been discussed earlier this evening. And there is some more language around improving evacuation routes in the community. We have also made a number of amendments to the strategies themselves. These are relatively minor, but they do include adding new implementation actions where appropriate and refining existing actions and existing strategies to better emphasize and clarify some of the topics that council members discussed at that time. Next slide, please. The CMAP with these revisions went before the Planning Commission last month. The commissioners wanted the project team to make a few changes that included clarifying some additional points. There were adjustments to the formatting to make the document more readable. And we also provided some additional information on the topic of co-benefits that planning commissioners had wanted to see. In response to the comments that were raised by the Planning Commission members, we have made some changes to the CMAP document. This is included in your packet for this evening, and this is just a list of some of those specific changes. The CMAP does qualify as a project for the purpose of the California Environmental Quality Act. The project team did prepare an addendum to the San Carlos General Plan Environmental Impact Report, the EIR, for the purposes of the CMAP's environmental review. The addendum finds that the CMAP would not result in any new significant environmental impacts, nor that it would substantially increase the severity of any significant impacts that are covered in the general plan EIR. And with that, I will turn it back to Adam to wrap us up. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli. And as for next steps, pending council's approval, city staff can begin implementing the plan, implementing the CMAP. The CMAP does include an implementation plan that will guide staff in our efforts, and we can return for request for funding to carry out the strategies as appropriate. We can begin by working on some of the near-term strategies with really high greenhouse gas reduction potential that those that focus on energy conservation, building electrification, transition to electric vehicles, and increasing composting, as we've heard about this evening, just to name a few of those examples. Next slide, please. So the staff recommendation for you this evening is to adopt a resolution that adopts the Climate Mitigation and Adaptation Plan and associated addendum to the General Plan Environmental Impact Report. Next slide. And that concludes our presentation, and we are happy and available to answer any of your questions.
Thank you so much, Adam. I appreciate it. So being that this is a new business item, we will now move to questions followed by public comment, come back for council comment discussion before any motion or a second is taken. So with that, any members of council have any questions for Adam or staff? So I'll start. So at this past weekend, I serve on the executive committee for Peninsula Clean Energy and also the board of directors. And it was our annual strategic retreat. And during the course of that conversation, we not only reiterated our goal of ensuring that we provide clean energy to the 20 cities and townships throughout the county within San Mateo County on a time coincident basis by 2025. We also discussed Governor Newsom's recent ask of agencies to see whether or not it's viable to bring carbon neutrality up from 2045 to the year 2035. Now, mind you, 2045 is a 24-year time horizon that sort of kicks the problem down to the next generation yet again. As a board, we asked staff to move forward with that more aggressive goal, and they'll come back with a report. And I wanted to better understand, Adam, from your perspective, Adam Lokar on staff, what the feasibility might be in our case to take a look at that possibility. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So the governor, has requested the Air Resources Board and the Public Utilities Commission look at that carbon neutrality goal. I do want to clarify, carbon neutral doesn't mean zero carbon. It means that any remaining emissions are negated through the purchasing of carbon offsets. That's involves paying another entity to remove carbon from the atmosphere, like restoring a section of forest in another country or something. Like that. And it's likely that the state will have to rely pretty heavily on carbon offsets to achieve its current targets and any potential more aggressive targets. Through the development of the CMAP, the project team, we always look for opportunities to make deeper carbon reductions, kind of reflecting the urgency that we heard from the community. And we heard through our outreach efforts, we went to the community and asked what types of actions people wanted the city to take, the community wanted the city to take to address climate change. And we saw support for bold, aggressive actions. And those are included in this plan. When we went to quantify those actions, based on scientific-based assumptions and the best available guidance and studies, we found that there's a reduction pathway towards meeting the state targets of the 40% reduction by 2030 and 80% by 2050, but not to exceed those targets. As a CEQA certified plan, the CMAP must be able to prove that these targets in the document are technically feasible. So that it would be challenging to revisit those targets to make them more aggressive. That being said, we're operating under known policy and technology solutions. It's likely that other opportunities will arise in the future that will allow us to push beyond these targets, as we've done in the past. So recognizing that, we have, since we last presented to you, we did add language in Chapter 2 of the CMAP to support taking those opportunities, and that these targets don't need to be viewed as a ceiling, and that we can certainly look for opportunities to push beyond them and support the state's more aggressive goals if those do end up getting adopted.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate it. All right. I don't see any further hands from council. So at this point, we'll move to public comment. Crystal, are there members of the community who wish to make a comment on this item?
Yes, we have 4 at the moment. First up is Dashiell Leeds. You should be able to unmute.
Hello, my name is Dashiell Leeds. I'm the Conservation Assistant for the Sierra Club Loma Prieta chapter. We're in strong support of the CMAP adoption tonight. We really appreciate the hard work of city staff, consultants, council members, commissioners, and community members who have been instrumental in the creation of this document. While we believe the overall targets could be stronger, we simultaneously believe that the actual measure language within this CMAP is really, really strong. We also appreciate the modifications that staff has made to this draft, particularly the language in documents pages 37 and 38, which they talked about earlier, which recognizes that the city can work to exceed the current GHG targets. So we really, really encourage this council to continue to direct and support staff to work as aggressively as possible on these CMAP measures and ultimately exceed the current CMAP targets. I think you've got some really good material here to work with, so we're excited to support the city and continuing to aggressively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dashiell. Next up is Kathleen Goforth, followed by Dimitri.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Goforth. I'm a resident of San Carlos, and I'd like to second the comments that were just made by Dashiell Leeds and also express my appreciation to the staff and consultants for all the work they've done to prepare the climate mitigation adaptation plan. There's some good commitments and a lot of great ideas in this plan to actually achieve the projected greenhouse gas emissions. Those commitments and good ideas need to be put into action soon. So I'm hoping this doesn't just become a document on a shelf, because implementation is what really counts. One thing I'd like to highlight is that when you look at the greenhouse gas emission reductions associated with each of the plan's strategies, it becomes very clear just how tremendously beneficial it will be to electrify not only transportation, but also our existing buildings, which currently use a lot of that short-lived climate super pollutant methane that you heard about earlier this evening. For this reason, I especially appreciate the commitment in Strategy 5 to consider in 2022 adopting local building code amendments to require gas, space, and water heaters to be replaced at the end of their life with electric models. I think that'll be a very important step. I do encourage, as Dash should, being as aggressive as possible, exceeding the targets if we can. So thank you everyone who worked on the climate mitigation and adaptation plan. I encourage the council to adopt the plan and act on it in accordance with the urgency of the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Okay, next up is Dimitri, followed by Suzanne Emerson.
Yes, hi. Can folks hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so this is the first time I saw this report in the council packet, and I took a quick look at it. And one thing that I think is a bit of an elephant in the room here is I didn't see any study on the carbon emissions that the San Carlos Airport produces, and I don't know if this plan addresses that. And the reason I bring this up is in a recent study by the Transport and Environment Group in Europe, they talk about how private jets have an outsized role in carbon emissions. Aviation is already one of the most carbon intensive modes of transport. And the private plane section of travel is without any peer the most carbon intensive activity that anyone can engage in. As an example, in just 1 single hour, a single private jet emits 2 tons of carbon, whereas the average person in Europe emits 8 tons over the course of an entire year. So this is an unparalleled climate impact. And so my one question is, we have an airport within the city limits. If we're addressing climate change, we need to look at that. Private jets are also used for very short trips, which compounds the carbon emissions. They're in fact 5 to 14 times more polluting than commercial planes per passenger. And one astounding fact from the study is just 1% of people cause 50% of global aviation emissions. I mean, think about that. 1% of people cause 50% of global aviation emissions. if we're talking about climate change, I think we have to look at
Thank
the
you,
airport
Dimitri.
and looking how to reduce that. There's one other small thing.
Thank you, Dimitri.
Okay, I also wanted to talk about lead exposure to the children in San Carlos. So I can table that discussion, but that's also something that we need to look at.
Thank you, Dimitri.
Okay, next up is Suzanne Emerson, followed by Debbie.
Good evening. This is Suzanne Emerson of San Carlos Green. We would like to thank staff and the consultants who conducted many community outreach opportunities in order to craft the CMAP. And we thank City Council for encouraging the creation of strong CMAP elements. The CMAP contains mitigation elements that are expected to be impactful, especially the elements that move towards elimination of natural gas equipment and support the transition to electric transportation. We look forward to robust implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Okay, and last up is Debbie. You should be able to unmute.
Thank you very much to staff for such an excellent draft report. I was unable to view the final report, but in the draft reports, it did indicate that they recommended at least a 25-foot setback from the creeks in town. And I hope that the city planning department and city council will look to achieve at least that amount of setback or hopefully increase the amount of setback as so much construction goes on in the commercial section and in the area along Pulgas Creek and other creeks. If we have a climate mitigation adaptation plan that recommends setbacks, but exemptions are given for new construction, then that sort of defeats the purpose. So thank you for taking that into consideration as you move forward with plans for our community. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Debbie. And that was our... Debbie, are you raising your hand again? No. Okay. That was our last speaker. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right.
Madam
Now
Mayor.
we'll move on to council comment and discussion.
Madam Mayor,
Councilmember
before
Collins.
we do that, I think you need a motion to close the public hearing, which I so move.
Okay.
Second.
All right, Crystal, can you call the roll?
Councilmember Dugan?
Yes.
Councilmember Rack?
Yes.
Vice Mayor McDowell?
Yes.
Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
And Mayor Parmalohan?
Yes. Thank you, Councilmember Collins, for the prompt. All right, council discussion on this item?
Madam Mayor, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Why don't we start with Vice Mayor McDowell, and then we'll go to Councilmember Dugan and then Rack.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just wanted to say that I appreciate staff's work and all of the iterations of this report, and I appreciate the public's feedback. I think that this report really reflects a lot of the input from the community over this process, and I appreciate that. I also appreciate the fact that we have 33 GHG reduction strategies. I think they're really broad spectrum of strategies, from education to building codes to improving our own city facilities. And the recycled water, I think, is very innovative. I appreciate that we have performance metrics in the plan. And I also really liked the implementation table with timeframes and resource needs. I think that's going to help us track our progress and plan out funding. And I'm looking forward to taking action on this plan. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilmember Dugan and then Councilmember Rack.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. And I agree with what Sarah had to say. I'm glad to see so many good, meaty things that we can engage with as a council now that we have going to set this plan. We've worked hard on it. I appreciate staff's effort and the consultants we've engaged. And my perception to the process is that this is a strong plan. And I'm glad to hear the Sierra Club chime in this evening and confirm that we're taking a good action here. And I would just point out that, and climate change, it's the mitigation of that has been one of our clear goals as a city. So, this is, right in line with that, obviously. And, couldn't be more important as we all watch climate change literally before our eyes, which is unsettling at best. And I would just point out, I think it's appropriate that we are, I believe, adopting this plan this evening as we previously had a robust discussion on housing. I'll just point out that transportation continues to be the #1 emitter in our county. And I just know, when we talk about jobs, housing balance, I would just encourage all of us to remember that's really also a climate change mitigation notion as well, because when we're out of balance, that's what has folks driving dozens and dozens of miles a day and commuting and really generating all those emissions out on 101 and 280. So our housing discussion, I actually think, is probably what we can most impact as a council is moving our city in a direction where people can live without being so car dependent. That balance can allow people not to commute long distances, but even as we think about mixed use and creating mixed use dynamic neighborhoods where someone can live, work, and play without getting in their car and take care of their day and all the amenities they need, and really becoming less car dependent, I do think is one of the most important things we can do as a council to enact this plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Dugan. Councilmember Rack.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I just want to reiterate some of the comments from my colleagues, but also just to thank staff and PlaceWorks for their support and the public. And I know the Planning Commission has weighed in on this a couple times as well, and all the work done by my colleagues here. And then I just want to sort of, I'm looking forward to supporting this, and this is a great plan, and I'm excited about going to the next stage of implementation and sort of as we look at sort of how we put this into place and into action, that I guess I would just encourage that staff that we continue to look at this, that the document becomes a living document, that we continue to get updates and understand kind of what's working, what's not working, where the council can provide extra support to help make sure this works and we help to meet our goals. So look forward to working with everyone here over the next, hopefully, several years as we put this into action. And thank you.
Thank you. All right, and I just want to lend my perspective. I want to compliment Adam and the team, Adam Locher and the team, for pulling this together. It contains many bold ideas. I am aligned with the public comment around making sure that we take swift action and do so quickly. As part of the discussion that we had in Peninsula Clean Energy this weekend, we learned that the ROI that is really most significant is building and moving us towards electrification. Transportation is obviously very important, but in terms of return on investment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, those building electrification codes are really important to us. And I also commend the plan for its commentary with respect to the various partnerships. We can't do this alone, so working with the subject matter experts across the county and the region, I think, will be really instrumental, as well as with the community. So I'm very much in support of this. I'm very proud of this. I'm so glad that council decided to make this a key priority that we'll work on, that we'll work on it into the future. And I look forward to taking actions quickly. So looking forward to those budget proposals coming forward. All right, so if there's no further comment, Crystal, can you call the roll?
Madam Mayor, I would like to move to adopt resolution 2021-94. A resolution of the City Council of the City of San Carlos adopting the Climate Mitigation and Adaptation Plan and Addendum Number 1 to the General Plan Environmental Impact Report.
Thank you. Second? Is there a second? All right, the second from Vice Mayor McDowell. All right, and Crystal, now can you call the roll? See, I'm so anxious to get this passed. I just wanted to skip closing of the public comment and the motion altogether. So, Crystal?
Okay, Councilmember Rack?
Yes.
Vice Mayor McDowell?
Yes.
Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
Councilmember Dugan?
Yes.
And Mayor Palmer Lohan?
Yes. Okay, all right, thank you. And that brings us to our next item, which is agenda setting. Does any member of the council have any proposals for future agenda items this evening? All right, seeing none, that moves us to item 11, adjournment. Thank you everybody for the discussion tonight. We got a lot of really great work done. Thank you to staff and members of the community for participating in creating our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Good evening, everyone.
Good night.